you're unwanted, streets are unbreathing. When you're down, when you're straight, faces come out of the rain. When you're strange, when you're straight, no one remembers your name. When you're strange, when you're strange, when you're strange, when you're strange. When you're a stranger, faces look lovely. When you're alone, women seem wicked. When you're unwanted, streets are unbreathing. When you're straight, faces come out of the rain. When you're straight, when you're straight, no one remembers your name. When you're straight, when you're straight, when you're straight, when you're straight.
Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back. Tonight we're going off on a tangent, and to be honest with you, I have a lot of tangent shows planned with different subject matter. We can't keep covering the same subjects and people, and so I've been sort of trying to broaden our horizons. And one of the things that I love best here is the ability to interview authors of interesting books. And tonight will be one of those kind of shows. For those unaware, I was a huge Doors fan growing up. Now, I realized that the Doors were way, way before my time, but the 1991 film, The Doors, really did change my life. I was kind of directionless, and I knew I wanted to be some kind of artist involving computers, maybe music, film, not really sure what I wanted to do. And that film sort of really changed things for me. I kind of watched that movie hundreds of times and went, yeah, I think I want to do that. Not the darker side of some of the stuff, but certainly the songwriting. And Jim Morrison became sort of a pivotal figure in my life. I started researching him, reading all the books. I watched that movie over and over. I started buying the entire, to this day, I still have the entire Doors discography on vinyl. I would go to the used music stores and collect any Doors albums, and then I would sort of, listening to the Doors music, especially because I was sort of a keyboard player, synthesizer guy, and I would focus on Ray Manzarek's keyboards in many of the songs, taught me how to play for some of my own songs. And by the way, I realized that I had covered that People Are Strange song I think it was 20 years ago now. And so I decided to start the show with it. So the book is called Jim Morrison's Secret Teacher of the Occult, A Journey to the Other Side. And it's by Paul Wyld. Here, I'll try to give him a good plug and hold this up here. And I'm a terrible show host. Things are a little rushed today, so I don't have the links for where you can purchase it, but we'll get it from him, and we'll put it both in the live chat and in the description of this video or podcast. I don't really, to be honest, I got the book a little late, so I haven't gotten through the whole thing, but I did make some marks, and there's some incredible points made in this book. For those unaware, Jim Morrison was very into the esoteric and the occult. He was a truth seeker of that era. And many of those sort of ideas that he had and that search for secret knowledge made it into the song lyrics and music. And I really think that he was an incredible and interesting figure. Selfishly, I'm so sad that he died so young. He was a member of the so-called 27 Club. He died at 27 years old, much like Kurt Cobain and many other rock stars. I always selfishly think if he had just lived, how many more incredibly great albums of music would we have possibly gotten out of him? I know that's a selfish thought, but that's what I think. Every time a songwriter I really enjoy dies, I thought it with Tom Petty. I thought it with Kurt Cobain and all of those grunge guys, Chris Cornell and so many other great rock musicians. So let's begin our journey. We'll bring in Paul Wyld. Welcome, Mr. Wyld.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's so good to have you here because you kind of remind, how you're a musician and you know how you get so into a certain band or artist, but then you kind of burn out of it and you move on to other things. Like right now I'm listening constantly to Genesis, Phil Collins solo albums and Peter Gabriel solo albums. And I haven't really listened to the Doors, but I spent so much of my childhood in my room with a record player, and it really made me want to be a songwriter. That movie, The Doors, made me want to be a songwriter. Kind of scared me a little bit about the darker side. But let's begin with a little bit of history. A lot of people may not be aware, but Jim Morrison's father was like a Navy admiral, right? And there was someone in the live chat claiming that his father worked for the CIA. In your research, what do you think of that? Because a lot of people think that he was sort of a anti-CIA counterculture guy.
Jim Morrison's father was like one of the most outstanding officers like America ever produced. He is a graduate of Annapolis, the Naval Academy. He flew Hellcat fighters in the Navy during World War II. He was present at Pearl Harbor the day that it was attacked. And he was an aircraft carrier captain, a commander, the USS Bonhomme Richard. Then he became a rear admiral. I mean, they were grooming him for to become part of the Joint Chiefs of Staff one day. Is it possible that he was in intelligence work connected with the CIA? Probably, but I haven't found any evidence to back that up.
Wow, and the a lot of the Jim Morrison mythos revolves around his sort of shamanic figure, right? Being sort of a shaman and the teacher of the tribe. And when you see and his incredible use of hallucinogenics, I have to say that I think that influenced me as well about Jim Morrison, because when I got a little older and those things became available to me, I wanted to see what that was about. And he certainly was a big supporter of expanding your mind. And there's that famous scene in the movie where he's arguing with the band and the band tells him, we took drugs to expand our mind, not to escape. What do you think of Jim Morrison's sort of exploration of all those hallucinogenics and how that might have influenced him artistically?
Well, first, just like you, when I read No One Here Gets Out Alive,
great book.
My friend Jimmy and I in high school was like, we got to find out what this acid is all about. I've talked about that in the introduction to the book, my first acid trip. So
yeah,
that's what got Jim Morrison's what got me off on the crazy path of psychedelics. Also, that's a huge topic, right? So, in the year that
DMT is becoming hugely popular now. Did you know that they're doing experiments with long dose DMT, trying to keep people in that DMT environment for hours on end by IV dripping it now? And they're trying to map hours, and they're trying to map the DMT sort of realm. They're trying to map it, and they're finding some crazy things, like people from different cultures, different religions will say the same things about the DMT realm that they go to. It's almost as if it really might be a real reality or altered reality, but like a different dimension that you visit when your mind is influenced by this.
I haven't tried DMT. I have a friend that he said he did it, and he had an out of body experience. He was high up on the ceiling in his room, and he could see himself down on the couch and with what seemed like an eternity. We're starting to go places again with psychedelics, and DMT is a big part of that for sure. So when Jim Morrison was born in 1943, like I start off the book this way, like
Yeah,
two
I didn't
events
know
happened.
that. That's the year they
Yeah,
invented LSD, the same year he was born. What a coincidence, right? And
so
he
in
was such
in
a big
April,
lover of
yeah,
LSD.
and that experience that he had when he was 3 years old, you know, where it took place is right where they, um, uh, the Manhattan Project happened at Los Alamos, where they split the atom, and Oppenheimer convened those scientists to begin the Manhattan Project in April of 1943, and that was the same month and year that Sandoz accidentally spilled the LSD-25, I think it's called scientifically, that he put on a shelf in 1938. In 1943, he took it down to just re-examine. I don't know what he was doing with it, but he spilled some of it on his hand, and he had a very interesting bike ride going home, right? And that and
Yeah,
that
I've read
changed
about that.
everything.
Yeah. Yeah. Could
So
you
since then, and then
imagine
the
like you're a chemist and you
can you
invent this
imagine, yeah,
stuff and yeah, and you just
you know.
spill it on yourself and like you're the first guy in history to have an LSD trip?
I mean, what did he spill the whole vial on his hand? I'm like, Jesus, like how many micrograms did this guy take, right? So he went back to his boss. He's like, I had a pretty interesting time here. We got to check this out. So somehow LSD makes its way to the United States, to the CIA, and the CIA tried to use it as a truth serum, and
Yeah.
it backfired on them. Their CIA agents were like discovering God, and were like, all right, I'm out of the agency. Like, I don't want to do this with my life, you know. And America's top
My
spy,
favorite CIA
you know.
project was that Operation Midnight Climax where they got hookers and they dosed everybody.
Yes,
That's crazy.
that
Our government did that. Like,
I
hey,
know.
you come into this whorehouse and get dosed, you know?
I think they did that. They did that in San Francisco, right? They had the hookers,
Yeah.
like, you know, bring them off the street. Yeah, and they had like secret cameras behind there, and they were filming them and all that.
They wanted to see what they would do. Yeah, what would happen. And what are you going to do? You can't go home to your family and say, like, oh, I was at this whorehouse and I got dosed with some kind of hallucinogenic drug. So
Yeah,
it was a good cover. Nobody talked. They just, tripped their
yeah.
balls off and then they got to learn about the effects of it, I guess. But yeah,
Yep.
it was crazy that the government is involved in this kind of stuff,
I strongly recommend reading a book called Acid Dreams. I forget the authors, but the title is Acid Dreams, like the social history of LSD, I think the subtitle. Excellent book, one of the best reads I've ever had. Amazing read. So Jim
Oh, I have to
Morrison,
put that on my
when he
list, yeah.
graduated UCLA, you could buy acid over the counter in 1965 when Jim graduated from UCLA. So he was just eating up like M&Ms, man. You know, and that it was outlawed. Yeah, just like you
I
can buy,
remember growing up.
you know.
I remember growing up. I would only take one tab, but there was always a friend of mine. He would eat like so many tabs, and I would go, "Dude, you're gonna go insane if you keep eating these things like that." When I was doing it, it was just a little paper, and you put it under your tongue. So, but that's years and years
Some
ago.
girl in high school, some girl was like dealing out LSD, and the cops came looking for her in the school one day, and she stuck that whole sheet, not to get caught, down her pants, and all
Whoa.
100 hits like soaked into her skin. We never saw her again. So, pretty freaking crazy stories, right? But so they outlawed it in. So it's a strange history. So the CIA tried to use it as a truth serum. That didn't work. And then it just somehow got into the hands of the pharmaceutical industry they could just sell. And then in October 6, 1966, 666, the state of California outlawed LSD. They were using it up in Canada for alcoholics, and to great success. People just stopped drinking after they had LSD experiences.
Well, yeah,
Yeah, great,
I certainly remember that there was like a lot of weird. Yeah, I used to call them like emotional tremors towards the end of an LSD experience, and you had these profound realizations about all these different things. So I could see where somebody that's having a real tough time drinking themselves too much or drinking themselves to death could have a trip and think about that and reflect on that and maybe the drug shows them the error of that path and they figure it out, right?
Yep. So many people have they become Christians, they become Buddhists, they become activists, environmental activists. It has done something to them that for the most part, has a really positive effect on your life. And I just from looking into all of that, it's like, the creator's like, all right, so if you're going to build a weapon of mass destruction, like, here's a drug that's going to make you realize just what, you're going to blow life up. What the fuck, you know?
Yeah.
It's very strange that those things happen at the same time. In Jim Morrison's birth year, and Jim Morrison has that experience with the Indians, that the dying native workers that leaped into his soul when he was 3 years old, the traffic accident, and those native
Yeah.
workers were on their
Yeah.
way to work at the laboratory that they were going to make a permanent installation. The natives in the area, New Mexico, they thought, well, they're doing something temporary. But didn't they stayed? They went on to make, like, the first thermonuclear weapons and all that kind of stuff. And the natives were like, we're about life. Like, we don't want this fucking shit around here. It disturbed the whole community, the national laboratory and all that. It's just strange that
Yeah.
happened to the eldest son of America's, like, one of America's most outstanding military officers, like,
Yeah. And
these Indians.
for those not familiar with the story, Jim Morrison was in his father's car, and there was a car accident up ahead of them, and some Native Americans died in that car accident. And I think to the end of his life, Jim Morrison swore that those Native Americans, as they died,
Yep.
flew into his soul and sort of affected him in some way at 3 years old, which I guess
He said that was the most significant experience of his life. And after writing this and looking at it, it's like, I really had to walk with Jim Morrison to write this. Like, I believe him, and like, I can see why he just felt so strongly that happened to him, and the effect that it happened to, that it had on him for the rest of his life. It just seems, especially from 13 years old on, his spiritual awakening really begins in high school. I mean, he's checking out, books on 13th, 14th, 15th century demonology and all kinds of other spiritual stuff in the Library of Congress. I mean, he's going to all these obscure bookstores, all over, like, Washington, D.C. and Alexandria, Virginia.
yeah,
And,
he was a voracious
he's
reader by all accounts from people who knew him. He was constantly reading books, which is interesting.
Exactly.
Because he
Well, he has
wasn't
not-
just some blown out, like, drug addict rock star. He was an
Oh,
intellectual.
no, not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all. This is somebody that could have been a sociology professor. If rock and roll hadn't existed, he probably would have been an experimental filmmaker, because he wanted to go work with Jonas Mekas, who's considered the godfather of experimental film in America, in New York.
Yeah, and interesting that you said in the book that he decided music was easier to break into because you didn't need all that equipment and extra
Yeah.
personnel. You didn't need all that gear and all the expensive equipment. You could just buy a couple $100 worth of instruments and be a rock band. Find 2 or 3 friends. That's interesting.
Plus, you'd have to go to New York where it's cold and get a job and pay rent and bills. I didn't think you want to do that either. He's like, fuck it, I'm just going to go to the beach and sleep under the pier, right? So when he graduated from UCLA in '65, he had an amazing girlfriend named Mary Werbelow. Mary's IQ was higher than Jim Morrison's. His was 149. She was even more well-read than he was.
This is
And
before
one day-
Pamela, then, right?
Yes. And when he graduated, his parents, he was living in his Goshen Avenue apartment in Westwood, over here by the VA hospital. And his parents pulled the plug on the rent and bill, said, hey, you graduated, you're on your own, right? And Mary was like, all you know are books, go find yourself. I think Mary was like, and if you think you're moving in with me, that's not going to happen. And they broke up.
Nice girl.
And then,
Nice girl.
Yeah. And Jim he hated Hollywood. He said, like, he told his friend Bill Cosgrove, Hollywood's syrup for the masses. Jim Morrison liked French New Wave films. He liked Contempt by Godard. His favorite actor was Jack Palance in that movie with Brigitte Bardot. Amazing film. I saw it in the theaters a few months ago. He liked Francois Truffaut movies. On YouTube, you can see him walking on the set with his friend Agnes Varda on one of Francois Truffaut's films. That's the French guy in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, if you've ever seen that movie.
Oh, sure. I'm sure my whole audience has as well. Yeah.
Yeah, those are Jim Morrison was like into some very intelligent, very artistic, really, really cool stuff, He
was all about, he seemed to be all about art, music, and culture and literature and ancient teachings as well, which is a weird mix. And you could kind of see that or hear that in a lot of his lyrics kind of reflect this sort of like weird sense of artisticness. And one of the things I like about the Doors is they weren't like a lot of the other bands of their era. They were very unique, you know. And you know what's interesting too is I remember I was trying to start this band and we couldn't find a bass player. And due to my fanhood of the Doors, I said, we have a keyboard player. Like, get a second keyboard, learn to play the bass part with one hand and play the other stuff, you know? And that's what we did.
Yeah,
like
Ray. Yeah.
We were very successful, and no one ever said, where's the bass player? Not one person ever said, where's the bass player? And, you know, other rock guys would tell, oh, no, you got to get a bass player. And occasionally we had one, but they never lasted. The band was a guitar player, a drummer, the keyboard player, and me. And I just sang because I could barely sing, let alone sing and play an instrument at the same time. So that's how that worked. Yeah. Do you think that if he hadn't become a musician, he would have eventually made films or do something else? He was so artistic. He had to do something in the arts. He couldn't do like a day job, you know?
No, so I mean, if it wasn't for rock music, like I said, he would have been a filmmaker. He would have been, you know, he definitely would have wrote poetry because that's what one of his first loves. He would have wrote novels. He would have painted. He would have found the traditional, you know, artistic outlets. But you know, rock and roll was brand new. He said it coincided with his life, you know, the birth of rock music, and like the very creative person that he was, he's like, wow, this is I can be artistic in this whole new realm. I can bring my shamanic self to the stage and open up my secret teacher soul this way. This person was on a mission. That's what I picked up after I read The Secret Teachers of the Western World by Gary Lachman. Now, Jim Morrison was something called a secret teacher. This is a person who is deeply in touch with that other reality. That's why I chose a quote to begin my book, the first Jim Morrison quote from his poetry, where he says, reality is what has been concealed from us for so long. And that's what he wanted to turn people back onto, like this thing that's been buried for 400 years. That if you went out there and said, hey, like I'm being in touch with cosmic consciousness and the unseen realms and the spirit world.
Yeah, people would think
I'm
you're
getting
nuts.
in touch with I'm getting in touch with my divine self. They're like, hey man, you're off to the stake, buddy. Like you're off to the Inquisition. You're out of here, you know. And suddenly in the 1960s,
it was such a rebellious time, the 1960s, right? So people were looking for other paradigms of you know, knowledge and things like that. So he came along at the perfect time, and it's in the movie too. That most famously, like I had the same problem when I first started. I was terrified of the audience. He turned his back to the audience, and the band would have to like yell at him to turn around and face the audience. He would just turn his back and sing the songs. He wouldn't even look at the audience. Like, so he's a little bit
this is a really big point to make,
right?
I have lots of problems with that movie. We'll talk about that movie. But that whole thing where it took him a while to turn and face the audience, like this is someone for 8 years was reading. He was, you know, reading and writing in his notebooks. He was inspired by Franz Kafka to take journals because Franz Kafka, the European writer, journaled all the time. So this is someone who was very private.
He was introverted.
When you're a poet, now, look, he was an inward-looking person, right? He was an INFP, just like Edgar Allan Poe was. So that's what he was doing for 8 years, and then, but you know, he's got, you know, astrologically speaking, if you're of that frame of mind, like the guy has a Leo North Node, and Leo North Node people, when you go in your North Node, you're born to be out there in front of other people, the champion of something really big, and that was that pull, right? So not only did his life coincide with the birth of rock music, it coincided with the Western world's first occult awakening. Like at the 1960s, like, you know, everybody was trying out. Well, for 400 years,
Age of Aquarius and all that stuff. Age of Aquarius and all that stuff.
Jim Morrison's rising sign was in Aquarius. You know, this person mentally, physically, his, like, if you want to go there, his astrological chart, all this stuff, it all just comes together. And finally just said to myself, like, gosh, like the creator just have this guy made in a certain way just to do all of this at a certain time. It's really breathtaking. It was so compelling. I'm like, this is going to be my first book, you know.
Yeah, and
So
isn't
yeah,
it interesting how
yeah.
he really did become like the archetype of a front man. And so many people, including me, I'll admit it, I emulated him. I got leather pants. I was like, I'm going to wear leather pants and black shirts on stage. And the reason why is
He
because
started
I
all of that.
knew
He started all
that,
of that.
yeah, but I knew that was timeless. And to this day, Paul Wyld, I can look at pictures of myself on stage and I don't look like a like a glam rocker or something that's stupid now, just black leather pants and a black shirt and you're the front man. It's
Hmm.
interesting that he kind of started all of that because so many others emulated that sort of style. I could think of so many guys with black leather pants and black shirts today. I just saw,
Hmm.
not that I'm a fan of them, but they're making a resurgence. I just saw Creed and he black leather pants and a black shirt, very
Hmm.
more Morrison-esque, I thought when I saw that.
Hmm.
He sort of created that. But it's interesting that he was so introverted because maybe you've experienced this too. If you're sort of an introverted, shy nerd, and then suddenly you're fronting a band, that's a total 180, and you're expected to just do that. So maybe
That's right. That's right.
I struggled
That's
with
right.
that a little bit, but it was easier for me because it was almost like a character that you create to do that.
Hmm.
It's like a defense mechanism or something like that. But on the
I mean,
esoteric side, oh,
I'm
I
just
was
saying,
going to,
eventually he just had to open up his world, right? If he's gonna, follow
yeah,
his mission through with music, he had to just open up. So, like I said, like with poetry, it's a private act, or like you're making film, it's a temporary thing you do with people, then they're gone. You write a novel, that's a private act, or like a painting. But when you're a rock band, you're open to the public. You show up live. Like that's a really,
yeah,
that you're dropping everything. You're just exposing yourself that way. So with Jim Morrison, you get two things. One, he had the physical stamina, the looks, and the talent to be a great entertainer and a great rocker. But at the same time, you're getting this whole other person that comes along every 100, 150 years. Somebody who's born to just like wake you up, to
yeah,
that
poet and a
other reality.
prophet. Poet and a prophet.
Exactly.
That's what I always think about him. He was a poet and a prophet, and
Hmm.
we're the. You're going to make me go back on a doors kick and listen to. I love one of the things I love to do, Paul Wyld, is take an artist or a band and listen to their entire catalog from beginning to end. So I think I have that in my future. But on the esoteric and occult side, I know the movie and that book. They mentioned like he was involved with some women that were like witches and things like that, right? So he was
So he was
into
he
some of
yes,
that.
he got involved with Patricia Keneally, who
Uh
was
huh.
a practicing Wiccan. She was a witch, and they were, I don't know if it went as it's depicted in the film, but they were married in something called the Celtic knot tying ceremony.
Yeah, so it's like a
Um,
Wiccan wedding, not a legal one, right?
that's right. Like someone asked me in a previous podcast if they thought that Jim Morrison ever participated in any kind of occult, ceremonial, magical rituals. It's possible that he did with her, but there's none that I could find that are documented. But Patricia Keneally was certainly someone who participated in those things. That's for certain. Jim Morrison, as far as his own, when you talk about the occult in relation to Jim Morrison, I I discovered that he got a book called The History of Magic and the Occult by Kurt Seligman in high school. And this is one of the very first written accounts of the Western esoteric tradition that talks about these secret teacher type people. And I read that book carefully because I knew that there was a relationship between that book and Secret Teachers of the Western World that I'd read, and there is. I mean, it's just an earlier version of the same thing. And I found out about this on YouTube. He had a roommate at FSU in 1963 named Ed Martin, and he was trying to auction this book off. And Jim Morrison signed it to his friend, a Christmas gift, 1963. There's a picture of it in my book. And Ed Martin said that he was one of the smartest, probably the smartest person that he ever met, right? And he found that book in the last 2 years of high school in Alexandria, Virginia. So Jim Morrison kept that book for a few years. Why he gave it away is anybody's guess. But after reading this book, oh, it's a magical book. It's a very artistic book. Kurt Seligman was a surrealist artist who escaped the Nazis in the 40s, moved to New York like the rest of them. They intermingled with all the local painters like Jackson Pollock and all that, and with their surrealism ideas. That had its birth in Freud and the unconscious and everything like that. That gave birth to abstract expressionism. And Kurt Seligman decided that he was going to write a book that goes to the roots of modern art, what people were doing in experimental filmmaking and symbolist poetry and surrealism and Dada and all of those things. I'm sure Jim Morrison just took to that. The feeling that I got is that the same effect that Gary Lachman's The Secret Teachers of the Western World was having on me was the same effect that Kurt Seligman's book was having on Jim Morrison. Because I was,
you're gonna give me homework. Now I'm gonna have to read that now. You're gonna give me some homework. Yeah. But I love stuff like that.
With Jim Morrison, you got to do some geeking out,
Yeah, yeah.
Sure. But all great reading, fantastic reading. And so then after that, I knew that I was onto something. And then I saw Lawrence of Arabia. I found out he watched that film too in film school, and that film
great.
Comes out
the original film, yeah.
Comes out in 1962, the same year the Rolling Stones were formed. And that film is all about this person that goes off into the desert and they become somebody else. They wreck their identity. And, so T. Lawrence is like, the first rock star of the 20th century when he was leading the Arab Revolt between 1916 and 1918 during World War I. He's like, there's like this obscure British officer who decides he's going to go lead the warring Bedouin tribes to freedom. He's going to fight off the dying Ottoman Empire of the Turks, and he's going to make sure the French and the British don't colonize them. And he was up there getting photographed in his white keffiyeh and everything like that. And I think that film helped to put a lot of ideas into Jim Morrison's mind, that you can have a very elegant, flamboyant-looking rebellion like T. Lawrence did in that movie. I'm sure Mick Jagger had the same idea. A lot of rock stars, from David Bowie on, say that film had a big effect on their unconscious.
Yeah, but isn't it interesting that, and I kind of, to be very honest, I was having a bad family situation when I really started playing shows and touring, and Jim Morrison sort of divorced himself from his own family, even going as far as telling people his family was dead, and sort of recreated himself in whatever image he wanted. Well, that's interesting from a psychological standpoint. Do you know what the rift between him and his parents were that may have contributed to that? Or was it just he felt so strongly that he wanted to recreate himself that he wanted to just divorce himself from his previous self? Or, you know what I mean?
I think, yeah, I've thought about this, right? That's a great question. So, like I said, his father was this very intelligent, very commanding officer. Jim Morrison called his father the commander throughout his childhood. And then you have Jim Morrison, right? Who has an entirely different, life path. Like the Morrison family, they have a long tradition of having contributed family members to service in the Navy, and Jim Morrison did not go in that direction. His father saw that he had no interest in that, and kind of, in his way, came to accept that.
At least he didn't force him into it. Yeah, I know people who were forced into a military career they didn't want, and it never goes well because they don't want to do it and they don't want to be there. But some families have that tradition that sort of pushes you, makes you do it.
So, yes, that's right. That didn't seem to happen here. The Morrison family was not an abusive household. What was going on there is his father was away a lot because of his naval duties, right? And his mother, she was doing the best that she could. She married a naval officer. She did not marry an artist. That was not his. Claire Morrison was attracted to a military man, and Jim Morrison was anything but. So I'm sure the relationship is kind of difficult, right? But Jim Morrison had to cut ties because, he needed the space in the room, to become himself. When he said my parents are dead, I think he meant that in the spiritual sense. Like they're just dead to me in this way that we can't relate to each other. My father is commanding an aircraft carrier, and I'm out there becoming a champion for something that is erupting in the world that hasn't happened in 450 years. He just needs space. Interesting enough,
I kind of resonated with that myself because my dad was like a drill sergeant at home. He was so strict, and so I went off on my own. We had a big falling out, and I just went off on my own, and did the same kind of thing. Just found, figured out who I was without my family's involvement or influence.
And I think your experience that's mine. Like, my family, a lot of my people in my family need to become a Catholic priest because we're in the Guinness Book of
That's
Records.
funny. Did
Yeah,
you know I spent 12 years in Catholic school, and I even spent time at St. Charles Seminary to become a priest. That's what my family wanted me to do. Yeah.
And we're in
my
the Guinness
dad
World
wanted
Book
me to be a priest.
We're in the Guinness World Book of Records of having contributed the most Catholic priests to the Catholic Church of any family in Europe, and I kind of said no. I'm like, hey, I like girls, and like this isn't happening.
That was the deal breaker for me. And I don't know about your experience, but mine is they send you to the seminary. They start sending you to the seminary when you're still in high school, and then they sort of needle you to, like, oh, this is going to be a great life. You'll be an educator. You'll be helping people, and they try to brainwash you into it. And I wasn't having it. I was like, no, the monogamy is the deal breaker for me, or not monogamy, celibacy. This is a deal breaker.
I just saw early on. I just saw early on. I'm like, the Roman Catholic Church is just an extension of the Roman Empire. It's just like spiritual colonization of the soul to me. Like everything you guys are doing in the Catholic Mass, like you take straight out of like ancient Greek, cult rites and things like that. I mean, even like that thing on the Pope's head, that thing, the mitre.
Yeah, I don't
right?
know. I don't recall what that's called, but yeah.
It looks like it looks like a fish's mouth because it is like that comes from a god, an ancient Phoenician god called Dagon, a fish god. And that's what's going on there.
That's funny.
It's in honor of a fish god. It's got nothing to do with Jesus Christ. So that was my. I just called them out on all their shit growing up, and I just found myself in rebellion just by fucking being myself, So.
Oh, I know something about that. So I was not aware. Are you aware of what his family's religious beliefs were like? Because I don't believe that I've ever heard about that. And I wanted to ask you. Question. What was his family's religious beliefs, and do you think that influenced him either positively or negatively in his music career?
I could not find anything that indicates that what his parents like religious, spiritual preferences were. I can't find anything that says that the family, went to church on Sunday or anything like that. That they might have been Protestant. I don't know. I read that. When Rear Admiral Morrison retired, he was getting into reading the Bible and things like that. Beyond that, I don't think Jim Morrison was exposed to like anything having to do with Christianity, like through his family. So he
saved himself 12 years of brainwashing then, or many years of brainwashing.
Now that said, I don't know if you got to that point and I know you just got the book recently, but I don't know if you got to that part of the book where in Florida, when Jim Morrison begins college, and he's living in St. Petersburg, and after he meets Mary decides that she's not sure if Jim Morrison believes in God. So she takes Jim Morrison to a church. And I think this is
I did get to that. Yeah, I
think this is just as important as the experience with the Indians. He was 3 years old. They got to the church, and Mary starts praying in the church. They have the church to themselves, and Jim Morrison's looking around like, this shit's crazy. Like, why'd you take me here? And this light, this little point of light starts to grow in the back of church until it's a blinding light. It scares the holy living shit out of both of them. And they run terrified, out of the church. And Mary said that was her answer from God to Jim. And Jim said, I don't know what it was, but it definitely was real. Now, it does surface, I believe, that experience in his poetry. He says things like, thank you, O Lord, for the white blind light. And at the beginning, if you read the beginning,
I remember that. Yeah, white blind light was in one of his poems.
If you read at the beginning of the collected works of Jim Morrison, he talks about the light. Why is light and blindness associated with holiness? And he concludes. He talks about Saul of Tarsus. Who was blinded, on his way to Damascus, and he became Paul, right? And then Jim Morrison concludes, man can assist in the salvation of light. Those are some pretty astute spiritual observations about a pretty heavy subject when you're that young. Jim Morrison was, his mind was really quite advanced. Like when in Notes on Vision, all of the in his poetry book, The Lords and the New Creatures, All of his observations about alchemy and his relationship with cinema. It's some pretty amazing stuff when you're 18, 19, 20 years old. I'd say this guy, when he graduated in 65, he had the intellectual maturity of a 35, 40-year-old with a PhD. I was continually amazed as I did my research.
Yeah, maybe that comes from being a voracious reader, like one of the things about people that read a lot that I find interesting is that they learn a lot, but they learn about what they want to learn instead of the formal education system where they sort of cram, this is what you're supposed to know down your throat. And you may have zero, like how many people have a real interest in things like trigonometry or sociology, maybe, or literature, French literature, some other stuff that they try to cram. You go, I have zero interest in this. I just got to get through this class, But when you're self-educated by reading a lot, and I just wanted to show this collected works of Jim Morrison, poetry, journals, transcripts, and lyrics. It's available
excellent. It's awesome.
Yeah, it's available in audiobook as well, which I like because I have long rides to a cabin in the Poconos, so I like audiobooks. And I mentioned that I'm a terrible show host, so before I forget, where can people get this book before I forget? Your book.
So the book came out a week ago today. And right now you can order it from BarnesandNoble.com and Amazon and at your favorite online vendor.
Okay.
It's starting to get shelved in the Barnes and Noble stores and other bookstores around the country.
Good for you.
And then, so then it's going to be released in the United Kingdom on October 24th, and then in Australia on November 13th. So
I have a Barnes and Noble not far from me, so I'll check it out. And one of the things I always do when I interview an author, if their book's in Barnes and Noble, I go and I turn it so that it's right in front of people instead of, sometimes they just put them in a row and you see the spine, but you don't see the cover. I go and I turn it. So,
I do this. I do the same thing with my favorite authors. That's awesome.
Good for you. Yeah. Well, good for you getting in all the bookstores too, because Amazon is one thing, but some people are still buying, physical books and they only buy what they see at the bookstore. They don't go on Amazon looking for certain things. I'm only a few chapters in because I got the book a little later, but I already see this as a great companion to some of the other books about the Doors. So if you are a Doors fan, you're going to love this book. And even if you're not, I think you'll like the book. When you see some of these esoteric and occult connections that Morrison had and put into his work, it's tragic that he died so young. And is he like the first? Well, him and Jimi Hendrix, I don't know who died first. That whole 27 Club, which was sort of resurged in the 90s when so many rock stars died at 27. It's a real shame.
Yeah, it's so Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin.
Joplin too.
They went before Jim Morrison, and Jim Morrison used to, get drunk and tell other people, "Hey, you're drinking with number 3," So the end of his life is terrible, and that comes after the conviction in Miami of the famous, March 1st, 1969 show where it's alleged he exposed himself to the audience. I have that part bookmarked because it was such a pivotal part of his life, and I thought that sort of contributed to like maybe some depression or there was a marked change in him. For those unaware, at a famous show in 1969, he sort of, I don't know if he got too high or what happened, but he was like yelling, screaming, raving, and ranting. He would sing one song and then he would just mumble through another song. And then he allegedly exposed himself, showed his private parts. And then the system, which was, don't you think that the whole sort of system was sort of scared of him because of the rebellious teens and the rebellious youth that he was sort of a figurehead leader for? And they pounced on that situation where he allegedly exposed himself to try to take him down. It seems so stupid today because, Paul Wyld, have you seen that they have these, I don't know if they're gay pride parades or what they are, where people can just walk around totally nude? Today you can do that. But back in 1969, he apparently allegedly pulled his pecker out or something.
And
10,000
he got,
photographs were submitted in evidence. Not one showed it. Not one
yeah.
eyewitness testimony
Yeah, but they
was presented.
crucified him over pulling his
That's right.
pecker out. Basically, they
That's
crucified
right.
him. They kept him tied up in court for months, right? Over this stupid charge.
And
But it did.
Robert Krieger in his book To Set the Night on Fire, he says like the one charge they did drop was the one he was actually guilty of, which was public drunkenness. Like he showed up wasted to the show. So they, you
Well,
know,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
they found their excuse to nail him. So 5 days after that show, on March 5th, 1969, the day the warrants were issued for his arrest, the Miami FBI field office, they sent a description of that show saying that he exposed himself, and they sent that memo straight to the office of none other than J. Edgar Hoover, the head
The
of the FBI.
FBI. Yeah, it's just
Yeah,
crazy to think about today. That like what? Like, let's think about this for a second. If a rock star today pulled his pecker out in the middle of a show and then put it back and just went on with the show or whatever, I don't think anybody would even care, right?
that happens like
But
once.
back in
What?
1969, they wanted to get this guy and shut him up and shut him down so bad because he was so rebellious and anti-establishment that I think they needed. This was a good excuse, and they sent these reports to the head of the FBI. It's crazy
Yeah.
to me that it
He
went
had
that far.
He had an 80-page. Yeah, that's right. He had an 80-page FBI file. His father actually tendered his resignation and went to the Navy to say, "Hey, I'll resign because my son is such an embarrassment." That's a big deal.
Oh, that
And
is big. I didn't know that. I never heard that before.
yeah, that's right.
His
And
father
also,
resigned his commission with the Navy
no,
over his
he offered to resign
offer to resign.
because offered to resign. That's a big step. Like I'm just gonna end my career because my son is like that being that embarrassing. So they just weren't gonna, on top of Jim Morrison's like very flamboyant rebellion, which I'm sure he must have had thoughts like, I think he must have felt that the U.S. government at some point was gonna come at him because of what he was doing, right? But I just don't think that especially the Christian right, which has so much influence, to put Nixon in the White House. Nixon was the guy who was also at the same time trying to get John Lennon out of the United States because John Lennon was about to go on an anti-Nixon, anti-war tour with the likes of Jerry
Sure,
Rubin and
yeah.
Abby Hoffman. Like they're just not going to have Jim Morrison out there like turning America's baby boomers on to cosmic consciousness and waking up to the other side and the spirit world and all this kind of stuff. Like they saw him as a satanic threat, and that's what they were telling their politicians. Like this guy's got to go, and they had their chance in Miami. They got him convicted. He had to. Part of his sentence was 6 months of hard labor, and his lawyers were like, if they want to send you to Rayford Prison, and that's Florida's most notorious prison to this day.
Yeah, and just so people understand, back in the day, they would send prisoners, and hard labor meant that they would basically give you like a sledgehammer, and you'd be turning big boulders into little rocks all day. Just nonsense work, not real work. Just like make you suffer.
That's right. Some of those inmates would go crazy, and they'll take their sledgehammer and like crack it down on another inmate's head. Like all kinds of shit like that went on.
It's
And
very
just
violent. Yeah.
so Jim Morrison remained on bond pending his appeal, and his lawyers told him, "Hey, like this is such bullshit. We're pretty confident we're going to get you off." But you're Jim Morrison, and he went to Paris to go find himself again, to start writing poetry again in March 1971. And he was telling his friends, though, I was like, I want some kind of reassurance that I'm not going to end up in Rayford Prison. Of course, there's no guarantee.
Yeah.
So his lawyers are saying, we're going to get you off. But if I was Jim Morrison, I'm like, well, fuck, like I have already been convicted of something that I didn't do. It's clear that they're trying to nail me. Now France doesn't have an extradition treaty with the United States. You could have just stayed there,
Yeah.
But I think it's pretty clear that this made Jim Morrison very, very anxious, very anxious. And I think it contributed to just kind of pushing him over the edge.
Yeah, I would think that would create a tremendous amount of anxiety, thinking that you're going to go do hard labor for 6 months.
I mean, when he was in Paris, he stayed in Oscar Wilde's room where he died. While he was waiting, while Pam and him his girlfriend, were waiting to move into their apartment, which is located in the Marais district of Paris. And they threw Oscar Wilde, the famous English author who wrote The Picture of Dorian Gray, They threw him in jail for 2 years in England, for corrupting the youth of England, with his literature. And
with his book.
yeah, it totally fucked his health up. He's like, just like Jim Morrison. He's like, I'm gonna go to Paris and see if I can get my life together again. Didn't happen. He died. And then here's Jim Morrison staying in the same room, and 3 months later, he's buried in the same cemetery as Oscar Wilde. It's crazy. It's crazy.
Yeah, that's a weird, strange coincidence. And they are
among many.
Yeah. So let's talk for a little bit about his sort of darker drug use, because he's most famous, I think, for for the hallucinogenics. But at some point, he became addicted to heroin, and I don't think that goes well for anybody. But it became a increasing problem for him as time went on, right?
No, he was never addicted to heroin. He tried heroin in Paris, and I think that's what pushed him over the edge with a heart attack. That's a complicated, mysterious. That's like literally a whole podcast in itself. Everything in Paris. It was his girlfriend Pamela Curson, who was addicted to heroin. And
Okay.
Jim Morrison hated this. She was having an affair with the French Count Jean de Bertouilly, while she was with Jim, and Jim just kind of turned a blind eye to that. He didn't like it, at all very much. So no, Jim Morrison wasn't on heroin. Now, Jim Morrison's drug of choice was alcohol, which is all kinds of every writer and poet in existence, likes their alcohol.
Yeah.
His friend Frank Lissandro, his college, his film school buddy that remained friends with him after he became famous at the Doors, said that Jim Morrison liked to just go to the liquor store and buy alcohol because he felt like the whole underworld, act of like buying drugs and the whole sneaky outlaw thing of it was beneath him. That he just would rather legally go to the liquor store, and buy alcohol and do that. And the Doors tried their interventions. Robert Krieger said that that he had his father talk to him about the drinking, and that he was off the drinking for 2 weeks. Then he went back on. And Robert Krieger makes a point like, back then it's the '60s, man. We were partying. We were young. It was like it wasn't like
maybe it's the time where it was like AA and very, I think that attitude.
Yeah, Robert Krieger was like, it wasn't like I could just take him to the Betty Ford clinic because no Betty Ford clinic existed back then, so.
Yeah. Well, don't you think, you're an artist, don't you think that artists sort of draw from that well? Like you mentioned, there's so many, great writers, artists, musicians. Sometimes they're big drinkers, It sort of loosens the gears of creativity. It has for me in the past,
It can. I remember one night we were recording a song in the studio, and we were getting high and doing some drinking and having a good time. Then next day went to go listen to what we did, thinking we made a masterpiece.
Playback.
We
Yeah.
made shit.
What the hell is this? Yeah. Well, you always need a sober guy in the band. That's like the designated recording guy. Because come on, dude. You guys can drink a couple. You guys could drink a couple and we could get through this. But you're not drinking 12 drinks and we're not doing this.
I think with us artists, like, we're sensitive people, and I think it's just like a natural thing to kind of want to heighten who you already are with, like, with alcohol and with getting
and drop those inhibitions. Yeah, drop those inhibitions. I ran a recording studio in Philadelphia for many years, and I was amazed at the number of people who would pay me good money to come in and record garbage because they were too wasted to actually do anything constructive. Some of them I would tell the truth. They're like, look, you guys got to sober up or you're never going to get, guys would come to me like, we want to record a full album. And they could barely get through one song because they were so blasted, And this is right before there was, everything was so easy to edit, So like there was still tape machines and punch-ins, And I was amazed at how many people would get just totally blasted and not get anything done and pay me lots of money to hang out in the studio and get blasted. So you're right. There's I don't know, maybe there's a sweet spot, right? Like some guys can figure that out. I used to know a guy that was a great vocalist, and he would drink 2 glasses of wine and then he would do his vocal tracks. And then maybe
Mm-hmm.
3-4 hours later, he'd drink 2 more glasses of wine, do some more vocal tracks. Just enough to, you know, I guess some guys figure out the secret sauce and some guys go too far, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Morrison is one of those people that didn't have an off switch. You think he was definitely an alcoholic then, right? Like he wasn't a guy that could have 2 drinks and stop. He was a guy that went full tilt. It seems to me, right?
I don't. That's another like really big topic. He did drink, and sometimes he drank all the way to excess. He was just determined to get as fucked up as possible. He told Robbie Krieger one night before they went on they did a tour at the show at this place called the Singer Bowl, that he was just determined to get drunk that night, you know, before they went on. It was a show that they were going to play with the Who. But first of all, it was just Jim Morrison's, like, he was just hardwired, you know, to see just how far he could push it. You know, that whole testing the bounds of reality that he was into, and just sometimes getting really drunk was it. I mean, this guy would go to parties, and he would just open his mouth, and people would just like throw pills into his mouth, and he had no idea what the fuck was going into his system. He just
there was a time.
Let's just see where the night goes, you know.
There was a time when, as a front man for a band, I thought that was my sacred duty. Like if I went to a party, like whatever there was, and this is in my younger years. I'm married, very stable, children. But back then, I felt like if somebody had offered me something, I felt like I had to take it. You know, I had some wild nights, especially mixing things. I always wondered about guys that mixed different stuff. Like you didn't even know what you, especially pills. You don't even know what what it is or what you're taking. You know, and you're right. Yeah. So he would just go to a party, and if people had Quaaludes were big back then, he would take those and then drink and then
benzos and all kinds of
benzos.
Stuff.
Yeah, it's gotta wear you down. Do you think that after, like, when he first started doing that kind of stuff, it was like all fun and games, but then it got dark as things progressed for him? It seems to go that way for many.
So in the beginning, he was generally very interested on breaking through in a very spiritual sense with psychedelics, like his friends that he hung around with and that he spent the night with in places like that. In between graduating from UCLA, when his parents pulled the plug on his apartment, up until the time, I guess, when he could finally get his own place with Pamela with the Doors, he was generally on a very, very spiritual path of breaking on through to the spirit world in a shamanic initiation sense, you know, with psychedelics. It wasn't just all about, you know, partying at all. Like he took that pretty seriously. That was part of his, that was part of who he was to come through shamanically on stage. So in the beginning, it really was about breaking on through, and that's what that song is about. Like, you know, that he's quite committed, you know, to this idea to affect a change in consciousness, you know, through his very provocative stage appearance in those songs, and breaking out through his psychedelics, he saw as the way at that time. So it didn't start off like the idea of excess and everything like that. I just think, you know, suddenly he was, you know, homeless in Venice Beach, and then
that'll change you. That'll change you.
Your band gets famous, and suddenly, like, you're rolling in cash and you're famous. So.
Oh yeah, and you made a point in the book that he was making a huge amount of money, and all he ever bought himself was a Mustang GT. I didn't know this either. I was very interested in that part of the book because I thought I knew a lot about him and his history. And you say in the book that all he really ever bought himself was a Mustang GT, and he bought his girlfriend a Porsche.
Yep.
And he sort of favored like dive hotels and dive bars and like the gritty side of a city. You would think having all that money, he would have like bought a mansion or, you know, I mean, they were making huge amounts of money, right?
Yep. So the Ray Manzarek and John Densmore and Barbara Krieger, like, you know, they did typical. I want to say typical. They did what I think what anybody would want to do.
Enjoy the money.
Kind of money.
They
would invest, buy a home, that kind of thing. Not Jim Morrison. He's just like Bill Siddon said, like his concerns were just of another world. Like that just didn't interest him at all. He just wanted simplicity. He just wanted his Mustang, a really good book, his journals, quiet time at his hotel room, the liquor store close by. And that's it. The guy, that's all he needed. Frank Cassandra said at any given time, sometimes you could see him when in between tours, he's just hanging out. So Frank Cassandra said on tour he was, he was more or less in some better shape when he came back. Like, he kind of gained a little bit of weight, and the beard came out, and he was very much in that whole Allen Ginsberg look. Allen Ginsberg with the beatniks who had the beard, right? And you could just see him talking to himself, like sitting in the cafes and restaurants and bars on Santa Monica Boulevard, just scribbling away in his journals. Because the guy's a writer, the guy's a poet. His mind is just so, just so open. Like, so you got 8 years of like, you've got 8 years of him just like, just reading so much. And then just suddenly one day he just lights a match to it with all the LSD and like the marijuana and the ideas, and the 60s are exploding around you and all this stuff. So, his thoughts and everything going on with him like demanded to he pay attention to them. So, he just could care less about the lawyers and the money and all that. I mean, I think the most extensive thing he might have done with his money was he got he invested in a clothing boutique that Pamela Curson, his girlfriend, was interested in getting. They called it Themis. I don't know what happened to that boutique. I think there was a lot of partying. I can't imagine managing that boutique.
I can't imagine her being addicted to heroin. That she was a very good businesswoman. So maybe it was just like a vanity project, and he funded it for a while for her, make her happy.
It was pretty expensive. I don't know exactly what became of the boutique or anything like that, but
So do you think? I was going to ask then. Do you think that he was better when he was on tour because he was surrounded by his friends and bandmates and maybe some more support? But when he got on tour, he would go off on his own and do the tortured artist thing by himself. I've kind of wondered that, like maybe he would have been better off to be on tour more, because this being a musician, like you party, but most musicians, if they're serious about the songs and serious about the band, they party to a certain level, knowing there's a show tomorrow night. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So do you think that he would have been better off continuing with the tours instead of the breakup and all that stuff? Because at least he would be surrounded by his friends and have more support.
He really enjoyed being on stage. Like he told his sister that when the Doors became very famous and the tickets got more expensive, and suddenly they're playing much bigger venues and all like the hip underground clubs around America, that he felt like he really had to give them their money's worth. He took that seriously. He wanted people to get what they came for. And he really loved performing, and he loved singing. He was born for that, right? So you're probably right about that. In the beginning, the Doors were seen as an avant-garde, kind of art house type of band. Those first two albums are just so wild and strange, right? But then, Light My Fire got really big. So at the same time that he felt the duty to give everyone their money's worth, he also told his sister that when he went to recite his poetry, like the audience just didn't give a shit. Like just when like American teenagers just come into your show just to like get drunk, have a good time, to watch Jim Morrison. Like, I mean, they must have been like, man, I hope he starts a riot tonight. I hope he goes crazy. Back in that and then you get there and you're getting all these like these. I mean, I would have loved it, but you're getting all these like symbolist, surrealist inspired poetry lines and all that kind of stuff. They must have been like, well, what the heck is this, right? And so that disappointed him. That part just did disappoint him. I don't know what Jim Morrison would have expected. I mean, you get that's not what teenagers go to rock shows for, to begin with. That said, he really loved performing. So yeah,
well, you got to know the audience, I guess, right? Because remember, I had so many different band members for some of the bands I was in, and one guy was like a classically trained pianist, and he decided that we should do like a 12-minute symphonic sort of introduction with no singing, and and like I went, okay, but I don't think this isn't gonna work. Like, this isn't gonna go over well. The audience is like leaving the front of the stage as soon as 2 minutes of that went. Need a little more, like the kids were coming to mosh and party and have a good time. They weren't coming to listen to a symphony for 12 minutes or whatever it was. I think it might have been 15 minutes, which at first I thought, this is a great idea because I'll be backstage. They can go play that shit while I get ready. No, didn't work at all. So maybe but I can understand. And just like Morrison, that guy was so pissed that nobody liked it because he worked so hard on it. And I'm sure he worked very hard on, I've never really written poetry. I write lyrics for songs. I'm a songwriter, which is sort of its own sort of poetry. But I can imagine, like, people, you work so hard on something. I don't know about you, but like, I make a whole album and like not a lot of people buy it. It's just disappointing. It's disappointing, right? You go, man, I worked so hard on this and the world doesn't appreciate it. But then he was so appreciated in the more pop, I guess, top 40 hits that they had. And they had, how many, do you know, like, how many big would you consider really big hits that they had? I know there's Break On Through and Light My Fire.
So
probably their two best known.
The tunes that went to number one were Light My Fire, Hello, I Love You.
Hello, I Love You, I forgot.
I think Love Street hit number one also, but don't quote me on that. He did tell Jack Holzman, the owner of Elektra Records, like, I just can't fucking sing. I don't know if he told him, but one day he told somebody this. I read this somewhere. I just can't fucking sing Light My Fire one more time live. I'm gonna go crazy.
Yeah, and then there was Alabama Song was pretty big, wasn't it? The Whiskey Bar song.
Yeah, he loved singing that. That's what got them signed.
Really?
That's inspired by Bertolt Brecht, because Paul Rothschild had Jack Holzman fly to Los Angeles saying, I must be fucking crazy. I want to sign this band. Can you come here and check this out? So Jack Holzman shows up at the Whiskey and listens to all the songs. Like, you're out of your mind. I want to sign these people. And then they played the Alabama Song. And then Jack Holzman's like, oh wow, they're doing Bertolt Brecht. This is really cool. Sign them.
Yeah, and to those, I really wish that we could play some more clips, but they copyright strike the hell out of anything like that. So. For those unaware, it's will show me the way to the next whiskey bar. Oh, don't ask why. Oh, don't ask why. Show me the way to the next whiskey bar. I'll tell you we must die. I tell you we must die. It's pretty dark for the time, right? But it was their first big song, I think. And I was going to ask you about their progression of material, because when they first started, they seemed a little more straightforward, four to the floor. They became a lot more experimental as they progressed as a band. And one of my favorite is the Soft Parade album, which is nothing. If you put that next to their first album, it seems like two different bands almost, right?
Yeah. So to me, like, artistically, their best record is their second one, Strange Days.
Yeah, that's probably my favorite.
The Soft Parade is Jim Morrison, like, entertaining madness. Like, the three,
yes.
Yeah, he's going there, right? And it's like there's like the three big anthems. There's The End on the first album. Then there's When the Music's Open, the second one, which I think is their best song. My favorite, anyway. And then,
yeah, it's one of my favorites. When the music's over, turn out the light.
Yeah. And then the third song that's like anthemic is the Soft Parade, and that's Jim Morrison, like, when your mind is blown and you've been drinking and like that's somebody who has just slammed decades of living into just 6 years, right? And the Soft Parade kind of like reflects that kind of madness, that kind of hole that you're in. That's what that album is to me. I like that album though. I like a lot of the tracks on that album. Their best album, a lot of people think their best album is their last one, L.A. Woman. They went into the studio and they produced that themselves. They were playing Riders in the Storm, and Paul Rothschild's like, I don't want to produce you guys anymore. This garbage. And then it turned out to be a really popular and a very critically very well received record. The last conversation Jim Morrison had with any of the Doors was in Paris. He called John Densmore and he asked John Densmore, you know, how's the record L.A. Woman doing? He's like, man, it's just taking off. It's like really doing great. So, L.A. Woman, they got back their sixth album, their last one. They were getting back to their roots. I really love I don't know if you've listened to the poetry album, An American Prayer, the one released in
Yeah, an American Prayer.
1978.
Yeah.
I think the music that the Doors made for that album, I think it's just as good as some of their best stuff. I think it's a great record.
Yeah, but I guess if you're looking for interested in like the singing Jim Morrison, it's a little different, you know, because it's just spoken word and the Doors providing the music and the backdrop, right? So
Hmm.
it's very different. Was that a commercial failure, do you think? I think so, maybe, compared to their other albums, right?
I don't. So with that album, I don't see that's a failure of any kind. I think that's a fantastic record musically. I think the poetry on it is great. It's great to hear, you know, Jim Morrison's voice, and you get to be intimate with him in a way that you never see him on the other albums. Just it's just spoken word poetry. And when he was young, when he was 13 years old, with his friend Fudd Ford in Alameda, California, that's where his love of poetry really begins to take off. He would get the poetry albums, the spoken word albums, by some of his best poets like Kenneth Rexroth, and they would play them. And then finally, he got to make his own poetry album. I think it's a fantastic record. I mean, commercially, what's success? It's successful if that record really, if the right people really like it a lot. If you love, if you love what Jim Morrison is
My
about,
definition is of a successful album is I have very low expectations. Mine is, did it make more money than it cost me to produce, not counting my time? Because I enjoy, one of my favorite things is recording songs. Just, I will always do it. I think I'll be 80 and I'll still have a little studio and record songs because it's cathartic for me. So
Ditto.
I'm sure it made them more than it cost them to make. I mean, a little bit of studio time to drop have Jim Morrison read the poetry and the Doors produce some music. So yeah, I guess you're right, but everybody is always so focused on the financial aspect to decide if that's, like some of these artists today, it's really unfortunate. I hear some people talking about, I think it was Dr. Dre or Snoop Dogg talking about he got like tens of millions of streams on Spotify, and he got a check for like a few $1,000s for tens of millions of streams. So
I got a friend of mine is a producer here in LA, and Jay Chidius, and he's produced everybody. And he was telling me the other day that Cardi B, has made her record label like 21 million, and all she's seen is 300,000.
Oh, it's just ridiculous. Yeah. And I thought that the age of the internet would kill a lot of these record companies from being so predatory, but they just morphed into things like Spotify. Spotify is the worst. They don't pay. I have a whole catalog of albums. I won't put them on Spotify because I don't want to check for 27 cents, and I know people that are getting checks like that from, it's just crazy, the predatory nature. Right.
I think more and more artists are just saying fuck Spotify. I think all of this is gonna come full circle. I was talking with a friend the other day. I think people are gonna start rejecting all this shit, and we're gonna go back to, just going about music the old-fashioned way, word of mouth. And if you're good, if you're artistically good, you got something to offer, you're gonna find those people who are looking for that authentic thing. And if you got it, I think you're gonna be good in the years ahead.
A lot of artists that I know went back to making physical CDs and even vinyl. And I have one friend, he says, I made more money selling vinyl and CDs from physical album than I made from iTunes selling the same album, because people still maybe want that physical album. I still love the big vinyl because you get the nice artwork. It's big. You can hold it in your hands. And you remember that experience. I mean, I can buy music on iTunes. It's okay. But I love that experience. You had to go to the music store, buy 5 or 6 albums that you've never heard and bring them home and experience that. Now, you know, kids today, I'm going to feel like an old man. Like these kids today, you know, I've got nieces and nephews, and I talk to them about music. Everything, the only thing that they know is iTunes and Spotify. And if it's not on there, they'll never hear it, which is kind of sad, but they do have most everything, and you pay the $9.95 a month or whatever you pay. You have unlimited music. It's a very different landscape now. Do you think the Doors would survive in a landscape like that today? I don't know.
Probably not.
Yeah.
I mean, David Crosby, before he died, said, you know, there'd be no way Crosby, Stills, and Nash would ever get signed today. You know, Joni Mitchell, the great singer-songwriter from the '62, she was at an A&R party a couple of years ago. She overheard, I read this in an article. She overheard this conversation with these A&R people saying, you know, we're not looking for talent. We're just looking for a particular look and a cooperative attitude. You know, we're just looking for people that we know have. Yeah, it's just pretty fucking soulless. You know
well,
there's
an awful lot more ageism than there used to be. Do you remember like the 80s and 90s pop stars? They were all middle-aged. You know, like Phil Collins and some of these people. They were already middle-aged and they were doing their thing and very successful. Or Peter Gabriel, or a lot of these guys were middle-aged, and women were middle-aged. And now it seems like you got to be, 17. And you're right,
man,
like
fucking,
certain look and cooperative. Yeah.
I took the second half of my book advance and I bought myself some Rolling Stone tickets. I'd never seen them. They came here to LA. And I'm like, I got to see him.
I heard that's an incredible. I heard that show's incredible, and they're in their 70s, so that's amazing.
I wasn't expecting much, but what I saw blew my fucking mind. He's 80 years old. He just turned 81. There's an 80-year-old guy running around entertaining like 75,000 people, and it turned into the best concert I've ever seen. I saw him on a Wednesday night, then I saw him on a Saturday. My friends like, we got to go back and see this again. I never saw anything like that. And the songs, it was like going to see Lawrence of Arabia, the movie we talked about, came out in the same year the Stones came out in '62. And you go see Lawrence of Arabia here in LA, the whole city shows up. It sells out. That's just like the Stones. Like, the songs are great, they're great. It was fucking amazing. So I think, rock and roll, you take care of yourself, you rock out, you got great songs, no one's going to give a shit about your age.
Yeah, Mick Jagger has a whole, he's got a whole semi-truck following him around on tour, and in that semi-truck is an entire gym.
Yeah, and he gets in there, on YouTube, he gets in there 3 hours a day. So the difference between Jim Morrison and Mick Jagger is that, so Jim Morrison was always naturally like, he never, in most of his life, he didn't look like the live, sexy Lizard King, right? He was chubby. This guy, when he was in college, is like he said, I would get up and go to the cafeteria at 6 a.m. because I felt like I didn't go. I'd be denied like all the free breakfast food, like. Now Mick Jagger, on the other hand, was always slim, and plus his
like anorexic slim, yeah.
And his father was a phys ed teacher, so like taking care of yourself and exercising was in Mick Jagger's mind, like at a very young age, like it just.
Yeah, and I guess the other difference is that Mick Jagger got out of his drug phase, and many people don't.
He did.
He
did. Yeah, he did.
I think a lot of artists do better work when they clean up, like David Bowie. I think his best albums were after he was. Well, some of his albums on drugs are great too, but some of his albums when he was cleaned up were better. I thought they were more focused, at least, right?
After he left LA, he was doing lots of cocaine here in LA, and he decided that he hates the fucking city. Sometimes I hate this fucking place. Then he went back and he made some of his best records after that. All of David Bowie's records are pretty good, if you ask me. So.
Well, this last album, Lazarus, was very sad because he knew he was dying while he made that album, But I have such tremendous respect for him because he made that album knowing he was dying because he wanted to give that album to his fans. He wanted to give them one more ride on the train here. Let's do, I'm on my way out. And it's so reflective and sad because that you could read the lyrics and know that he knew that he was dying through the making of that album. It's
Yeah, David
interesting.
Bowie and Leonard Cohen too gave us two amazing albums right before they passed away. I thought that was really incredible.
Yeah. Oh, I guess Freddie Mercury too, right? He was dying when they
Hmm.
made the last Queen album. I guess
Hmm.
that's it gets in your blood so much that you want to do one more before you know, go, I guess.
I think if Jim
So
Morrison was able to clean up, if like he could have survived all that, that the Doors would have made at least a couple more great records.
yeah, I was going to ask, do you think that they would have made some more records if he didn't die tragically?
Totally.
Like, do you think they would have gotten, because they were so young, right? They were all like 27, 30. They weren't old men, you know?
Hmm.
And it's kind of like, it wasn't like a, we're breaking up forever. It was kind of like, well, I'm going to go do my own thing. This kind of played its course for now. And maybe
I
the
think for
door was
that to
still
happen,
open.
yeah, yes, I think like for that to happen, Jim Morrison would have had to do what Mick Jagger did, is like get on some kind of like he would have to change. No more drugs, no more drinking. You know, take care of yourself. You know, rock and roll is a blood sport. You got to be in shape, man. You know, to get out there and rock it and really win the audience. Like you've been on
You're
stage,
right
takes
about
a lot
that.
out
You
of
know
you.
what? I'm working on a hard rock album right now, which is not my usual thing. And I suddenly realized like I got to start doing more cardio because I'm not in the shape to do this. I'm just not in the shape
Hmm.
to sing hard rock songs. Like, I got to go do. You're right. It's a blood sport, right? So I start sort of exercise plan, and the whole thing in my mind is I cannot be fat Vince Neil. I cannot be fat Vince Neil. I cannot be fat Vince Neil and do this. I got to be in shape, So I'm
Or
running.
fat Axl Rose.
Oh, Fat Axl Rose is bad too, right? But
Hmm.
that's another band that like does incredible live show.
Hmm.
Just incredible, and they're older guys, well, comparatively. But like you're right about. I've heard so many of my friends. I'm not a huge Rolling Stones fan. I realize their significance. I realize their importance and their status as legends. But just my brother killed Rolling Stones for me because he played that Beast of Burden song over and over and over again, and we shared a bedroom. And after a while, I was like, I hate the Rolling Stones. Whatever album the Beast of Burden song is on, he played that album so much that I couldn't stand Rolling Stones. But I certainly, Sympathy for the Devil, and they have so many incredible songs. Oh, my point was, I've had like 100 friends tell me that they went to see the Rolling Stones and it was like the greatest rock show they've ever seen. And
Yeah.
most of them were surprised. Like you said, they weren't expecting that much. They're 80-year-old dudes, But God
Yeah,
bless
like
them.
when that track "Sympathy for the Devil," like that backdrop on that stage, that was some badass shit, man. That was I was like, wow, this is
Yeah.
fucking great. All of them
Can
were
we
great.
can we
You know,
can we talk because I don't know somebody that like you that knows all this history, and I would love to know after Morrison died, was there any discussion of getting a new singer and continuing in some way, or like did they just go without Jim? It's not going to work. I mean, there were some attempts. Like, didn't they have? They had in the late '90s or early 2000s. I think they had sort of a, they would get like a guest singer and do some things. But why do you think they never try to continue like so many bands do when a singer, we just had, I'm not a huge
fuck.
fan of,
How are
I'm
you
not
gonna
a,
replace Jim Morrison? How can you
well,
replace Jim
but,
Morrison? I
but
mean,
bands do it, I'm not a huge fan of Linkin Park, but they just reboot it with a female singer. And interestingly,
they chose Ian
everybody I
Astbury.
know wanted that gig. I know 5 singers that tried to send demos in to get that gig, but the
Hmm.
Doors never really even attempted it. They never, and it's surprising to me because did they just live off, and the financial end, did they just live off of the royalties so they were okay and they didn't need to keep going? And that maybe that contributed. They were financially well off, so it wasn't a big, like they didn't need to make new albums or get a new singer. I was always curious about the aftermath with the remaining members because they're up until recently they were all still alive, like a couple of years ago, right? Is there one still?
John Densmore, the drummer, and Robert Crew, the guitarist, is still alive. Ray Manzarek
Ray
passed away,
Manzarek died a few
unfortunately.
years ago. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, they talked about it, but I mean, they finally they chose somebody. Um, when they went on tour in the year 2000 as the 21st Century Doors. I thought they picked a cool person. They picked Ian Astbury from the Cult, and I saw that show.
Oh,
I
you're
saw
right.
them
I
at
remember this now.
yeah.
Because of that Doors film, they got hugely
Hmm.
popular again. So I guess,
Yeah,
yeah, they went and did a tour, right?
right. And in
The Cult singer's a
2000, well,
great singer.
the show, that movie came out in '91, and then they went on tour with Ian Astbury in 2000. I think no, 2001, 2002, but I saw them in 2003 on an Indian reservation in Tucson. It was awesome, man. Like, so it was monsoon season, and a thunderstorm was coming in from the desert, and like there was like light rain and like thunder in the distance, and they chose that to go into like Riders on the Storm to start the show. It was really cool.
That's brilliant.
And then like halfway through the second song, they were playing Roadhouse Blues, and the energy was there, and suddenly me and like along with the rest of the crowd were like, well, this is not a nostalgia act. Like, they're here to put on a fucking concert. And Ian Astbury that night was like, okay, tonight the gloves are coming off. And it was a great fucking rock show. It was great. It was good.
Oh, that's
John
really cool.
Densmore has had a falling out with the Doors over the years, so that night it was just Ray Manzarek and another drummer and Robert Krieger on guitar. But that was a
Well, everybody
fantastic
knows
show.
nobody cares who the drummer is unless it's John Bonham. Nobody cares about the drummer. I used to
I
joke
think
with
yeah, I think
drummers.
John
I used to
Densmore
joke
John
with the
Densmore's
drummers.
awesome.
I said, "Listen, I can replace you with a $50 box. Shut up," you know. But yeah, Densmore was awesome. So, as far as getting back to your book, like you explore a lot of topics. Basically, like don't take this the wrong way because I love Jim Morrison too, but the book really seems to me to be sort of a love letter to this really incredible, artistic, creative, powerful person. And you touch on so many things. What do you think Morrison's influence is on all of culture and especially on music? Because
Hmm.
it seems like I guess everything comes in ebbs and flows. Maybe there'll be a remake of some of the Doors material or movies or something else to popularize them again. But what do you think his influence was? And you in your book you explore so many topics. I don't even know where to like go next. So maybe something that you really found incredible about him that you discovered in your research.
Hmm. Just the relationship that he has with this thing called the Western Esoteric tradition. Like, we know him as a rock artist. He's one of the best. He helped found the rock and roll. He's also a great experimental filmmaker. His film Highway and American Pastoral is fantastic and inspired Dennis Hopper to make Easy Rider. His poetry is great. He was influenced by Arthur Rimbaud, and he wrote short poems like he did. And turns out he's one of the best, poets of the 20th century. But you zoom out even further, this thousands and thousand year old tradition that is the Western Esoteric tradition, and I saw like, wow, he has a place in this. He's also this, and that's really, really. I felt that's really, really important to write a book about this. Like, the evidence is just compelling of the people that Gary Lackman talks about, and the secret teachers of the Western world, who they were, what they did, what they were about, their personality traits, their challenges, the persecution, all of it, the whole 9 yards of their lives. Jim Morrison, his life mirrored all of that perfectly, almost too perfectly, actually. The book kind of wrote itself. It was just a matter of putting in the research and the time and the effort. And when you mention like a love letter, yeah, it kind of is that. Jim Morrison said that he got all kinds of his fan mail. He said it was like written by, like, they were very sensitive letters, very sensitive, intelligent letters, and he was humbled by that. And I think that gave him a sense of like vindication that going into rock music turned out to be a good thing, because he was reaching people in the way that he wanted to reach them. He was affecting a change in their consciousness. He was pointing their attention to that other reality that we got to get back in touch with. If we're gonna, if we're gonna be alive, if we're gonna save ourselves, man, if we're not gonna slide into the Gulf, right? So And yeah, you're right in the way that the book is kind of like a letter of admiration that way. I was very mindful of like the cultural magnitude of the person that I was writing about. So I just worked really hard just to make a very clear, interesting and fun case that he's a secret teacher as well as a rock star and a poet and a filmmaker.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't want to ruin the ending of the book, but uh, the one of the things that touched me because Morrison really influenced me as a singer and a songwriter is you write this, and I want to share it with our audience because I think it's so important. Human beings need a sense of meaning to release these hidden energies because they live and evolve by eating significance. As a child eats food, uh, and you'll have to forgive me, I'm a little visually impaired. The deeper a human being's sense of wonder, the wilder their curiosity, the stronger their virility becomes, and the more powerful their grip on their own existence. Release the hidden energies of all of the gods and myths of the ages within you. Celebrate your firm persuasions uh, peak experiences, your glories, the mother of all creativeness, and your madness, verifiable manna from heaven, with as much creative fun as Jim Morrison had with the Doors. Tomorrow we enter the town of my birth. I want to be ready, which the last line is a quote from Jim Morrison, right?
Hmm.
Just how I was mentioning on the show that one of the things I love is just talking to or about creative, powerful, artistic people. And I think you're right. I think this guy was like one once in a century kind of artist. And it's so sad that he left us too young. Like I said at the beginning of the broadcast, so I'm always so selfish. Every time I hear of somebody dying that's a great songwriter, like Tom Petty hit me hard because I
Oh,
grew
me
up
too. Me too.
playing that free falling song. I remember I had some girlfriend that had a convertible. And
Hmm.
as soon as I knew she had a convertible, it was still the era of mixtapes and mix CDs. So, I put the Tom Petty, we got to drive around in your car with the top down and play free falling and, the Tom Petty songs.
I couldn't get into my house one night in Santa Monica, so I spent the night in the steps of the parking lot across the street from the emergency room at UCLA Med Center Santa Monica on Wilshire. I heard all these sirens and all this stuff and looked over.
Oh, so you were there when they took him
It
there.
was well, I didn't realize it till the next day. So the next day, like I picked my ass up off the damn cement, figuring out how I'm gonna get into my house. And this reporter just like comes up to me. She's like, what do you think of Tom Petty passing away last night? I'm like, what are you talking about? Like,
Oh, wow.
I was like, wow, that must have been all the commotion last night. That was terrible. Too young in his 60s. I saw Tom Petty a couple
Yeah, and
times.
I
Fantastic.
believe that they're saying that his death was fentanyl related because he had some pain
Oh, really?
issues.
I
He
didn't know
had some
that.
pain issues, and he took some pills from somebody on that last show or something because he was in pain and didn't get to a doctor to get a prescription or whatever. He thought it would be okay, and so yeah, the scourge of fentanyl it's taken so many people, but when it takes somebody like that, you really hate fentanyl.
The quote that you just read. Thanks for reading that. I forgot about that. That's from
Yeah,
Colin
I hate to
Wilson.
say it. People know this. Like I didn't get the book till yesterday, so I read the first like three, maybe on to the fourth chapter. But I had to skip to the end to see how the book ended. And when I read that, it hit me really deeply because, like I said, I lived by that. Like I discovered Jim Morrison, and that helped make me a good artist. And it
So
helped.
that
Well,
quote is from
yeah.
Colin Wilson's The Occult, and
Oh, interesting.
Random House approached Colin Wilson, the English writer, in 1968, like, we want you to write a book on the occult. And Colin Wilson agreed to do that, and it was published in 1971, which the year Jim Morrison passed away. And basically, everything that Colin Wilson was writing about, Jim Morrison was doing on stage. I'm sure Colin Wilson was like, wow, like, Jim Morrison is one very spiritually awakened, aware person. I'm sure of that. So that's where I thought that quote was very appropriate and um, uh, very much in line with who Jim Morrison was. Jim Morrison, and like if Colin Wilson had lived like was born 12 years later, I think he would probably been a rock and roller too. Because Gary Lackman was a rock star. I mean, he helped found Blondie, and then he read Colin Wilson's The Occult when he was at Chris Stein's place in Manhattan with Blondie, and was blown away by it. And then he ended up becoming an occult writer. Gary Lackman's books are amazing. He's a wonderful man. He was very generous and very patient and kind with me when I got in touch with him. And years earlier, I'd read a book by him when he called himself Gary Valentine, and about how he moved to New York City with his guitar, and he was living at an abandoned department store building in Manhattan and was sleeping with like shattered glass everywhere. And he met Debbie Harry's boyfriend, and they were living together at the time. He took them back to their apartment, like, hey, we're going to form a band. You want to be in this band with us? And Gary Lackman ended up writing Blondie's, breakout hit single "Ex Offender." They threw him out of the band because
I didn't know that.
they threw him out of the band because he was like jumping around the stage too much, and they just wanted to be like this more chill band, I guess. I don't know why. I mean, in rock and roll, you jump around the stage, right? But the effect that the Occult had on Gary Lackman.
I used to hit guys. If they just stood there and play, I would go over and kick them and tell them to move around the stage more.
Gary Lackman would appreciate that if you told him.
I would have kept him. Yeah.
So I thought that quote from I thought that Colin Wilson quote was appropriate, and I mentioned that a couple more times, in the book. That's what I hope people get back to, man. I hope they put down the phones and the laptops and all. They take a break from like cyberspace is great, and doing all this is awesome, but cyberspace is also going to take you to some places where you can just lose yourself and get lost from yourself, and like there's
people. I struggle, Paul. I have children, and I struggle with the amount of time they're in front of screens all the time. I'm always like, let's go outside, go for a walk, let's go ride bikes, let's go do something. And I also have a cabin in the mountains, and the first cabin, my wife sort of, oh, we got to get electricity. Oh, we got to get internet.
You mentioned the Poconos. Where do you live?
I live in Warminster, just outside of Philadelphia, but my cabin is in Goldsboro, in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania. And the first cabin sort of eventually evolved into very modern, but I'm building a new one now that my wife has agreed she's never going to go to. And that's a little more up in the mountain, and there's no neighbors for a mile or two in every direction. And that cabin is going to be candles and oil lamps and a wood stove, and that's it. That's your entertainment. You want to be entertained, sit and watch the fire. Because I'm really big, I have a background in computer science, but I am really big on just unplug it all, and just run away for a little while, read some books, and disconnect. Because you're right, there's great things in cyberspace, but there's also, it's a little too much. It feels like it sucks you in, and you see all the people walking around, zombies twiddling their phone.
Yeah.
I don't want to be.
Sometimes I'm wondering, I'm like, who the fuck is gonna read my book? What the fuck am I doing this for?
Yeah, people like me. I'm telling you, I'm gonna take it to my cabin this weekend and finish it for sure. I learned a trick from, I'm not a big Bill Gates fan, but I learned a trick from him, and that is, see, this is my pile now, and your book is in it. I learned a trick from Bill Gates, and that is, whatever you got that you want to read, you have to dedicate the time to do that, but just put it in a pile, and when you get to it, you get to it. So I take this pile, including your book, to my cabin, and I'll get to read these. It's a great little trick, because I actually get through things that way. I don't have time to read it here. I'm too busy. Life's too busy. Just put it in a pile and then get to it when you get to it. I'm certain that any Doors fans would really, really appreciate this. In fact, I have a friend that's probably old friend that's probably a bigger Doors fan than me, and I'm going to buy a copy and gift it to him, because I think that there's so many things in here that I didn't know, that I'm sure there's going to be things that he didn't know as well in this. It's just.
I hope my book inspires more people to write more about him.
Yeah, and what I will say is that this is incredibly well researched. People here know that I'm a big fan of people that actually do their homework and actually research things. We have a saying here that's from somebody else, but have facts in hand before putting mouth or pen or keyboard in gear. And
I
you
like that.
certainly have facts in hand here. There's so many little nuggets of things about Morrison and his life that I didn't even know. I didn't know about the. I knew. All right, I'm sure that there's some mention of it in that other book, the Main Doors book that everybody talks about. That
No one here gets out alive. Yeah.
no one here gets out alive. That he liked like seedy dive hotels and didn't buy a house. But I didn't know that that's really all he bought was a Mustang GT, a nice car for him and a nice car for his girlfriend. That's pretty much all the most extravagant expenses he had. That's crazy. He had to be making hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. And back then that was a huge amount of money. So you're right. He was an artist he liked artistic things and books and alone time and solitude and writing and reading.
Here's something that a lot I didn't put in the book because I kind of made the connection like after I'd written, is that I think this is an important point to make, is that so Colin Wilson wrote a book called The Outsider in 1956, made him famous, and it's a study of all the classic romantic personalities in the past, and Jim Morrison read this book pretty closely. And Colin Wilson was interested in why people have such high highs and such low lows, like those peak experiences that I talk about. He talks about Van Gogh's the starry night. That's a peak experience when like the world is just alive, right? And that's how Van Gogh wanted to make that peak experience come alive in a painting. But Van Gogh committed suicide a year after he painted that, and in his suicide note, he wrote, yeah, in his suicide note, he said, like, misery just goes on and on. It just never ends. It's very similar to something that Jim Morrison says in American Prayers, like, could any hell be more horrible than now and real? Now, on YouTube, there's a really good documentary called the Jim Morrison special, 3 Hours of Magic. And Robert Krieger talks about a very, very telling experience that him and John Densmore had with Jim Morrison one night. Is that so Robert Krieger and John Densmore were sharing a home in Laurel Canyon here in the Hollywood Hills. And Jim Morrison was suicidal. He really, they felt like he could take his life that night. They spent all night talking him out of it. And then before sunrise, he went to go take a walk. And when he came back a short while later, he was in a completely different mood. He was completely euphoric. And he had all the lyrics written out for People Are Strange. He wrote that on the spot. He wrote that on the spot when after being just suicidal and just changed. It's as if the person that wanted to take his life just, an hour or so earlier was just gone, like just didn't exist. And Robert Krieger says that they went through this with him a few times. So Jim Morrison was a classic romantic outsider this way. This person's peak experiences were, Himalayan, like, he was just flying, and his lows, he crashed. And sometimes he crashed to the point where he's like, he was telling them stuff like, what's it all about? Like, why do we have to go on like this? Like, why do we have to put up with this? It's just ended. So, being Jim Morrison was not easy at all.
Well, I know you're not a psychologist, but do you think that sort of extreme highs and extreme lows may point to like maybe he was bipolar in some ways, or
probably? But I make the point in the beginning, that point made by John Mack when he was writing his book about T.E. Lawrence, that psychoanalyzing someone is not how you're going to learn about their artistic accomplishments, because then we're just going to say, well, Jim Morrison's bipolar like anybody else, or we're going to miss the whole point of who he is. But that might be part of that. That might be part of that. But those highs and lows are seem to be, part of what makes that. Real creativity is dangerous. Real creativity puts you out on the edge. Real creativity is like, fire in your hands, right?
You're right.
And
the edge of madness.
That's
Genius.
why I
Yeah.
love that book. I think you would like. I think you and your viewers are probably really like reading The Outsider a lot. Jim Morrison, just like these people that they just left society to so they can be more receptive to these things called peak experiences. Now we all have peak experiences, and Steinbeck talks about that in East of Eden. In that quote you said where it talks about your glories, there's an amazingly beautiful passage about you can judge a man's life by the number of glories that he's had. He's talking about peak experiences when you just feel so in touch with the universe and everything around you. Uh, the English writer
Yeah,
G.K.
those are
Chesterton,
fleeting moments, but those are the best moments of
right?
your life. You know,
And
like
that's
I can
where a
think
lot
of
of the
the birth of my two boys was one of those just crazy peak experiences, or just even a couple of times being alone, looking at the stars in the mountains. Just this euphoria. And I was going to
hmm
ask you too, like so much of Morrison's work, it seems like it came from a very dark place. And it seems to be a kind of a theme, like there's so many artists. Robin Williams comes to mind. The guy made hundreds of millions of people laugh in his
hmm
lifetime. But
love them.
he was a very, very depressed, tortured kind of person. Do you think that's just a breeding ground? Like, and a lot of comedians are like that too. They're very, very dark in their personal lives, and great songwriters tend to be like a lot of great songwriters tend to suffer from depression, anxiety, crippling anxiety in some cases. You think that's just a breeding ground for great art sometimes? And
Yeah,
isn't it interesting? Like Morrison's so
yeah.
dark, but then there's like pop hits like Light My Fire that are like sort of pop hits of the day, you know?
Robbie Krieger wrote that. That was his first song.
Oh,
But
interesting.
yeah, so Jim Morrison. Actually, this is like a factual thing in the Oliver Stone movie. Is that Jim Morrison said everyone go home and write something with fire and earth themes and all that. And that's what Robert Krieger did. And that song, the first song he ever wrote, just happened to go right to #1. So that's a Robert
Imagine
Krieger
that.
written
Like,
song.
what the
Yeah,
kind of luck, man? Oh, that's the stars aligning right there,
yeah,
right?
right. To say the least, right? But yeah, you think you're right. It just goes hand in hand. Like my favorite comedian, he died. Mitch Hedberg. He was hilarious.
Oh, he
Turns
was
out
great. He was so
you know, he,
great.
he had a heroin problem too. But he had major highs and lows. So I think the high. You can actually go on YouTube. There's a great um uh, uh video with Colin Wilson. He was alive talking to Jerry Mishlove, and the show was actually called the highs and the lows. And I think these peak experiences with their valleys just go hand in hand with real creative talent. I think so. Jim Morrison loved Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, and he has a statement. He who breathes in the air of my writings is conscious that it is the air of the heights, and that it can kill a man. And that I realized that I think partly what Friedrich Nietzsche was talking about were peak experiences, that if you open yourself up to more peak experiences, like maybe perhaps your falls can be like, real falls. Like, Nietzsche had many, many peak experiences like in his life, and he
Yeah.
wrote out of those. And some of us, like, so when you're a person like that, like what you're saying with these highs and lows, you could be bipolar, all of that, and you marry that with real creative genius and real talent, then you're talking about when you're going out in the mountains and you're in nature and the stars and all that. You're going to be you have a secret teacher soul to you. You're going to be compelled to want to make art out of that. You're going to hear songs. The songs are going to march in from your right brain into your mind, and that happened to Jim Morrison on the beach in Venice Beach. California is beautiful. That's why I love it out here. The nature is fantastic. If you're an art, this is why this place attracts artistic people. Pennsylvania is awesome too. I rode my motorcycle through Pennsylvania. I was surprised. The nature there is amazing. but, but out here in the ocean and all that,
I've lived other places. I always come back here. So it's just home to me. It's
So when
familiar.
in
Yeah.
1965, Venice Beach was just dilapidated shacks and like the canals and all that kind of stuff was really quiet. And Jim Morrison just heard lots of songs, in his mind, and when he was out there in that summer, wrote 5 or 6 of some of rock and roll's best songs.
Yeah, it's interesting as a songwriter too. Sometimes people ask me like, "Where do you get all these songs from?" And I don't have a good answer. Some of them feel like they just fell in my lap. The ones that I
Yeah.
work the hardest on don't seem to work. It's those 20-minute ones. Those are the ones that
Hmm.
just come from the universe. I just channel in, tune into the right whatever. I don't want to get too philosophical, too woo, but
Hmm.
like sometimes they just come to me, and I write them down and figure them out before they fade. And the next time I guess showing up is a big part of it, right? You got to
Hmm.
work to try to get to that state. I was going to ask you one more question that I've always wondered about Morrison, because he was real big on, like you said, breaking through and on, altered states of perception. Was he ever exposed to like Buddhist meditation or the other kind of meditative techniques? Because it seems to me
Hmm.
that like maybe hallucinogens is a shortcut. Like I have a friend that's a big meditator, and we were talking about altered states of consciousness, and I mentioned
Hmm.
LSD and mushrooms and hallucinogens, and he basically says, well, that's cheating to get there that way. The hard way is meditation. Did Jim Morrison have any exposure to that or interest in that sort of mind altering meditations as opposed to the hallucinogens?
Not really, but that just wasn't his like that. He wasn't hardwired to break on through that way. Now Ray Manzarek and Robert and John Densmore,
I know that they did.
they were into
Yeah.
that, and Jim Morrison really appreciated that. And Jim Morrison was very receptive to Eastern mysticism. Like he loved a book I talk about in my book. He wrote the book written by Herman Hesse called Journey to the East. He was like, wow, like everything is all right there in that book. So he was very receptive to Eastern mysticism, for sure. Take It As It Comes is partly inspired by they went to go see someone that Ray Manzarek and all they were into, like an
A
Eastern
guru.
guru. I forget, yeah,
Oh.
I forget his name. Jim Morrison like went right up to him and looked deep into his eyes and saw that he was for real. So that that partly inspired Take It As It Comes, which is on their first record. So people have different ways to get in touch with that other reality, and for people like Jim Morrison and Colin Wilson and Gary Lackman and myself, we do that. I've been a reader my whole life. Intense concentration and study is how is one big way for me in my life how I get in touch with that other world, that other reality, that magical place. You can do that through meditation, absolutely for sure. I've done some meditating myself and had at the Self Realization Center out here, and I've had beautiful experiences that way. You can do it through martial arts, through painting, through there are all kinds of ways. I mean, like the at my school, the monks came one summer when I was in college from Drepung Losing Monastery, like the Dalai Lama's monks, and they do this thing where they make a sand mandala, and they spend months and months working on this sand mandala. And the point is that the creative act gets you in touch with that right brain part of yourself, that other reality. And then at the
Yeah.
end, it's not. And then at the end, they take the sand mandala, they take it to the lake, and they throw it into the water, because the whole point is the creative act.
so, yeah,
The
so
whole
yeah.
point is the whole
No,
point
I
is the
think you're right.
creative
I think
act.
you're right. Well, I'm building this cabin in the Poconos, and I started doing a lot of stonework, and I found that stonework to be so meditative and good for me. Trying to fit these things together and get them all to fit. I built a stone hearth for the wood stoves. I built a stone shower, stone floor in the living room, all from the natural stones around. And you got to be creative to figure out how to fit this bunch of rocks. But there's something about it. It's just meditative, and it feels like therapy to me, and it's
Mm.
cheaper than regular therapy, and you get to listen to music while you do it. So there is something about that repetitive, or chopping wood, even like this repetitive task that puts you in a certain brain space, right?
That's right. That's right.
it's
So yeah, Jim
it's
Morrison was absolutely receptive to all kinds of like Eastern mysticism and all of that, because all that was converging in California. California is like as far as Western ideas can go. On the other side of the ocean is China and Japan and Southeast Asia, and all that comes together up in San Francisco and like around here in Los Angeles, right? It's like the farthest extension of the West, comes into the East in this area.
Yeah, it seemed like, especially around the Doors time, everybody was getting into that Eastern meditation and philosophy, and everybody was seeking. It was a time of
Hmm.
seeking for
Yeah.
everybody. So, yeah, what a
Well, a lot
great.
of so Jim Morrison, when he was a kid, like he actually witnessed an actual renaissance. So when he was living in Alameda, the first 2 years of his high school years, him and his friend had a really funny name, Fudd Ford. They were going to San Francisco, and that was in the mid '50s. That's when like the beats were getting together around Lawrence Ferlinghetti's City Lights Bookshop, and they came up with a whole new way of how to express themselves in the English language with their poetry and their novels and all of that kind of stuff. And they would go to that bookshop. Like Jim Morrison actually met Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and he was listening to Kenneth Rexroth records, and all of those poets and writers are very, very influenced by Japanese poets and Chinese poets and ancient Chinese mysticism and all kinds of stuff. So that definitely informed Jim Morrison's consciousness for sure.
Well, it's interesting to see that, like, as an artist, he was sort of, because I feel like a lot of great artists do this. I try to do this. He was taking in like all of these different influences and then mixing it up his own way and reflecting it back through his music and his lyrics and his poetry, right?
Hmm. That's right. So with yes, like that's what so Jim Morrison, his thing was like the symbolist poets, the wild guys, Charles Baudelaire and Arthur Rimbaud, and he loved poetry by Allen Ginsberg. So with songwriting, you're a songwriter, so you know this. Like with songs are different from poems in that lyrics have to be as clear as highway signals to captivate the listener.
Yeah.
And Jim Morrison had a real gift. He had a very gut level, direct style, right?
He had a
So
very good
he
gift for
he
language, for sure. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
and he took that and he could really turn a phrase in the songs that he wrote in a very direct way. So he had a gift for that, and that came from poetry. Somehow, like with him, like lyric writing becomes poetry also with Jim Morrison. I'm amazed at all the different places you can go to about Jim Morrison with his mind and his consciousness and his art. Like we could talk all night, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Well, we're kind of running out of time though, so I don't want to keep you. I don't want to
Can't
keep
do
you.
that.
I could talk. I could talk about this guy for 5 hours because it was so. I don't think that I would have pursued being a songwriter if not for that movie, and then getting the vinyls, and Ray Manzarek especially, like, because you could go around your neighborhood when I was a kid and somebody's parents had some organs, you know. So I went around and looking for organs and stuff, like knowing that because it wasn't in vogue at the time, but I knew like these are powerful instruments. And then of course synthesizers really bit me. When I got to synthesizers, I was like, this is it. I could do everything with this, you know. And the thing with no bass player really affected me. I go, who's going to know? Just figure it out, and sort of gave me, I guess Morrison gave me the roadmap to being a good front man too,
Hmm.
So it was, I don't think I would have been good at it if not for that influence. Him and a few others, of course. I tried to mix them all together so that I wasn't just, I don't think I would have done well just being a Jim Morrison ripoff in the 90s,
I
wouldn't
mean,
work too good.
Jim Morrison really loved Elvis Presley. Like, Elvis Presley was a total badass in his leathers, and of course, that's where Jim Morrison, and a lot of other rockers got the leather idea. Here's an interesting like tidbit, um, to end this all, is that he loved Elvis, and him and Jerry Hopkins, one of the co-writers of No One Here Gets Out Alive, the first biography on Jim Morrison. So they were drinking one day on the patio of Barney's Beanery here in West Hollywood. And Jim told me, said, "Hey, I would love to read a biography about Elvis Presley." And that inspired Jerry Hopkins to write the very first biography of Elvis Presley, which
Oh,
Elvis
that's
the
interesting.
biography. Yeah, and it came out in 1971. But
I
with Jim
guess he never
Morrison,
got to meet. He guess he never got to meet Elvis, did he? Are
I
you
haven't
aware?
read any.
Yeah, I
Maybe
haven't ever
I
seen
haven't read
anything.
anything.
Yeah,
I know that Led Zeppelin got to meet Elvis Presley. There's a famous picture with them visiting him at
sure.
Graceland and all that
Yeah,
kind of stuff. But
Yeah,
that whole Lizard King image, I came to realize was, you know, with the leather pants and all that was, that's Jim Morrison, the secret teacher, right? This person had a very, very old soul, right? Like he's channeling all this ancient energy. Those people back then, like the ancient Egyptians, like, they didn't have religion, they were religion. They saw their land as like a reflection of heaven. That's where we get the whole as above, so below idea. The land of
sure.
Hermes Trismegistus. So like the snake skin is like, reptiles, very, very old. And that lizard skin, that lizard king image that he projected, just it gets into your unconscious mind that somewhere deep down inside you, you know what Jim Morrison is about. It's just bringing back something that, we want to, get in touch with. That whole lizard king persona he came up with was really brilliant.
Oh, I agree. Yeah, and it's been emulated so many times. Like I said, I just saw Creed, and he's wearing black leather pants and black boots and a black shirt. Very, very similar. And I'm sure he influenced hundreds of, aspiring rock stars to dress that way because it's timeless. It's timeless, and it's a good like archetype, and it seems to fit like a front man. Like this guy looks like he belongs in, as the head and focal point of this musical group. I certainly
Jim Morrison's
emulated that.
he's also a Sagittarius, and like Sagittarius people, like they get away with just like putting on jeans and a t-shirt, and somehow it's like the most fashionable thing that there is. Like Britney Spears and Alison Moss Hart and the Kills and Karen O and the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, like they dress very simply because they're fucking Sagittarians, man. They walk off with the crown that way. That's what this chick told me around here, man. She's like, fucking Sagittarians, like they don't have to try at all.
Well, listen, I really appreciated our conversation. Are you working on a new book that coming up, or are you kind of just riding on this one for a while? And I mentioned I'm going to put the links to where you guys can purchase the book. I highly recommend it. I'm really enjoying it. It's kind of renewed it kind of reminded me like, oh yeah, like so much of my music stuff started with a fascination with Jim Morrison. I'll put the links in the description of the video or podcast, and I'll put it in the live chat. But are you working on a new book, or is this kind of it for a while from you? Because I could tell that this took you a few years to get through, right?
Like I said, I started. Well, first of all, thanks a lot for like those really awesome compliments. That I'm glad that book did that for you. That was the goal. That was the idea. So I started writing it in March 2020, and what I would do is I would write, then I'd put it away for like 3 or 4 weeks, then come back and be like, oh God, I gotta keep doing this, and just kind of process that way. Like
micromanaged it a little bit, I think. Yeah, that's a big project. It's such a huge project to go through this.
I just like, I got the best books on how to like, write a good nonfiction book, and like the message was the same in all of them, just be a ruthless editor. So I was just really ruthless with myself, like, to get a good book out of it. I hope it is. Out there I think I want to write a book about Neil Peart, the drummer in Rush.
That would be interesting.
That's out there in my future. Not right now, but out there in my future. He's a secret teacher all himself. He wrote all of the songs, and here's a person who is very influenced by Eastern mysticism. You have songs like Mystic Rhythms. There's lots of songs like that, and there's various phases in their career where they change artistically, but the mystical sense is more or less always there with them.
Oh, okay. Well, interesting.
There's another person that died too soon. I was very upset.
Yeah, absolutely.
Away.
Yeah, I hate when anybody that's in a musical group or singer or songwriter that I really enjoy dies. And like I said, I'm always selfishly thinking, like when some of these songwriters that I really love die, I'm always like, man, he probably had like so many, if he could just lived a few more years, we would have gotten like 3 or 4 more great albums out of him. Like that's a selfish thought, but that's what I think. And I think they'd appreciate that, knowing that you're opining over what they didn't do, or that they didn't give you one more album, always leave them wanting more, I guess. So it's sad. Well, listen, I really enjoyed our talk. You haven't been here before, so after I throw you out and I'm going to do a quick wrap up solo here. You can just shut down and you don't need to stick around. But I appreciate you doing this, and keep in touch if you have a new project. And I will definitely add the links here. And
Hey, Stephen, thank you. Thanks for having me. This was
no,
a
I
great
appreciate it.
conversation.
I love Jim Morrison. As soon as you contacted me, I was like, absolutely, a book about Jim Morrison. Let's do it. So I appreciate you. Thanks for really shedding some new light on an old interest of mine. I really appreciate it. Now I'm going to have to
Thank
go
you.
listen to the whole Doors discography again. Maybe read a couple of the books again.
Oh, gee, bummer.
Yeah, back down the rabbit hole. Oh, I'll enjoy it. Thank you very much, Mr. Paul Wyld. You have a good evening, sir.
You too.
All right,
Thank you.
bye-bye. All right, friends. Well, what an interesting, this is what I call the tangent show. So I appreciate all of you indulging me. I hope that you enjoyed. I don't know too many people that don't like Jim Morrison, even just if you even just enjoy some of the hits. There's a huge influence of mine, and I'm sure that I emulated, some would say copied, some of Jim Morrison's style when I started becoming a singer and a songwriter. One of the things that didn't go well is that whole, I don't know, I sort of thought from the Jim Morrison mythos that if you're going to be a front man, you gotta do a lot of, let's just say, explorations. And I certainly did. That's years and decades behind me. Now I'm much more boring, but back in the day, boy, there was a lot of, let's just say this, there was a lot of party favors around. And I felt like as the front man of the band, I had to be like Jim Morrison and do them all. Luckily, I never had any really, truly bad experiences. And I stayed away from certain of the worst kind of drugs because I didn't even want to risk, having an OD or big problems or addiction. But interesting that no matter how much, I thought I knew a lot about Jim Morrison, but this book is teaching me that there is so much more that I didn't know about Jim Morrison. And that's a testament to a great author. And I think Paul Wyld did an incredible job researching this. There's a lot of stuff about his early childhood and family and family life that I really didn't know about. It's really sad that he died so young. And like I said, selfishly, I would wouldn't you love to see like Jim Morrison solo albums, maybe 5 or 10 years after he died, I think he would have had a great solo career or a resurgence with the Doors, Tales of the Sonic Voyage is here and says, good one, Stephen. Yes. Tim Houston says, great show. Good interview. So we have good feedback. And listen, I want to ask you in the live chat, we're going to start doing what I'm going to call a tangent show. Like we're going to go off on a tangent. That's not our usual subject matter, maybe once a week or once every 2 weeks at the very least. Because to be quite honest with you, I think I don't want to say I'm losing interest in UFOs and aliens and all the craziness, but there's only so much, there's only so much you can say about some of the same people, the same stories, the same situations. And I constantly try to remind myself that when I began this show, we were supposed to do shows like this, like we did tonight. And somewhere along the line, we just got lost in the weeds and we too intensely follow a certain subject. So I got to start realigning things, even just to stay sane, right? Different topics, different subject matter, different people. This author Paul Wyld probably doesn't really care or know about a lot of the topics that we cover here. He's not in that scene, so we got to go outside of that scene and talk to different people. And like I said, you guys know I say this all the time. I really love powerful, creative, artistic people. And tonight we got to talk about Jim Morrison, who's just a monster of a creative, powerful, artistic person. And Paul Wyld, what a great, I'm so glad that he kind of, I think his publicist found me, I think, not him. just going through booking him on podcasts to promote the book. So I guess the stars aligned and we got a good guest. So we'll take a moment to thank you, kind and generous benefactors, remembering that we are a viewer-supported show. I don't see any super chats, so we're good on that. We want to take a moment to remind you that you can buy me a beer, and the instructions for how to do that. It's really from buymeacoffee.com/truth seekers. And we want to take a moment to thank. Let me log in here so we can check. I think that our MVP of buying me a coffee was back today. So we have to take a moment to thank, of course, Mike Larry is the MVP. Mike Larry, what an incredibly generous person. For those unaware, with Buy Me a Coffee, it's in $5 increments. And so Mike Larry bought 23 beers. So you do the math. That's 23 beers times $5. Very, very generous of our MVP of Buying Me a Coffee, Mike Larry. And we also want to take a moment to recognize a very, very kind and generous PayPal pledger. Got the biggest PayPal pledge I've ever gotten. They wish to remain anonymous, but I just want to mention that there are some incredibly generous people with these PayPal pledges. And they know who they are. I think they want to remain anonymous, so I'm not going to mention the amount, but I'll just tell you that, boy, it sure put a smile on my face logging into PayPal, seeing that one. Biggest single PayPal pledge we've gotten in our show's history. And the message is simply keep doing great shows, and I will do my very best to. So for those unaware, if you become a YouTube channel member during the live broadcast, we give you a shout out. Just click that join button. If you send a super chat, we read all of those. No super chats tonight, but to be honest, I'm kind of okay with that because especially when somebody's new here and we're trying to do an interview, I don't want to be interrupting them with a dancing cash clown every few minutes. I was going to leave them to the end, but we appreciate all of you kind and generous benefactors. I'll take a couple of comments and questions from the live chat. ML said, I saw Morrison's film. I totally forgot. Yeah, and Richard Warner says, Morrison studied filmmaking at UCLA with Francis Ford Coppola and George Lucas. Is that true? Really? That's amazing. Like, what a boy, I would love to be in that class. If I had a time machine, that would be on my list of things to go do. Take a film class with Francis Ford Coppola, Jim Morrison, and George Lucas. That's incredible. Incredible. I hadn't heard that before. I think I heard the Coppola one, but George Lucas was in the same class as them or same program, maybe around the same time. Archaic Revival says, I'm the guilty conscience of the show. Just let that sink in. And Jason Parker mentioning he's a Sagittarius. Yeah, I don't want to get too deep into woo. It appears Mr. Paul Wyld is into astrology. I'm not sure what I think about astrology. I have a friend who makes charts, and I think some of that stuff is interesting, but then some of me thinks, I don't really think that the stars and the planets and their alignments have anything to do with my life. But some people swear by that stuff. So to each his own. Questions or comments for me, please put them in all capital letters. Richard Warner says, Morrison was sensitive. I think all artists are. And, I think it's part of the artist's journey to learn to not be so sensitive. When I first started releasing songs, man, if anybody said anything negative, I would just, it cut like a knife. And I could get 100 positive comments and one negative, and that one would just hit me in the heart like a ton of bricks. And then it would make me like kind of crazy. Like I didn't want to release another song for a long time. And I felt like I had to keep working on the next song so that nobody would comment negatively. I mean, it's kind of stupid to think about now, because after a while you figure out, oh, wait a minute. Art is subjective. And I think I've told this story before. I once got a painting of a horse that was running, and it was ahead, and there was other horses behind it, and there was dust behind it. And there was something, and you see all the muscles on these horses, and they were beautiful horses. And I bought this painting and I brought it home. My wife, I think she was still my girlfriend at the time, was living with me. And she was like, "Where are you putting that?" And I'm like, "Right in the living room. It's a beautiful painting." And she was like, "That's the ugliest painting I've ever seen in my life. You're not putting that in the living room." And this, of course, gave me an education into women make decorating choices. If you're a man, don't just buy a painting and bring it home and think your wife's going to put it up anywhere you want. That it don't work that way. But what it really taught me was that art is subjective. I was so mad that I put that painting out in the garage, and I showed it to everybody who visited our home and wanted to know, like, do you think this painting is ugly or great? And I swear it was like 50-50, and it didn't make any difference. You know, like, some women thought it was a beautiful painting. Some men thought it was a beautiful painting. Some women thought it was ugly. Some men thought it was ugly, but whatever. Different age groups. It just taught me that art is subjective. And I looked at that painting and fell in love with it. I thought, this is one of the most beautiful paintings I've ever seen. And to me, it spoke to me about like the struggle of leading the pack and winning the race and all of these sort of philosophical things. And to my wife, it was the ugliest painting she'd ever seen, and she didn't want it in the house. You know? And then like I said, I got so mad that I started to interview everybody. What's ugly about it? If they said it was ugly, what's ugly about it? Why is it ugly? You know? But eventually I kind of learned, like, oh, like, art's subjective, and some people are going to love what you do, and some people are going to think it's the worst shit they've ever seen or heard, and there's nothing you can do. You just got to play to the people that like what you do. So eventually I stopped being so sensitive. Actually, if somebody had told me years ago that I could create a whole album and release it in 1 year's time, I would have never believed you. This People Are Strange that we started our show off with, you know, it hasn't aged that great, but it's a 20-year-old recording. But in any case, that was on a project that took me 2.5 years or 3 years to make one 10-song CD. My first album probably took me, like, I think about 3 or 4 years to record it. Now, not so long, because I figured out, like, oh, just, you know, suffering over it for another year isn't going to make it any better. It's going to make it a little different, but, you know, eventually you start finding your way as an artist. Yeah, ML, I never liked the Mona Lisa. Me neither. I think it's an ugly woman. Like, okay, people think this is a beautiful painting. It's a beautiful painting of an ugly woman. She's a manly looking woman, right? She's got a man face. Like, I don't like the Mona Lisa. And you know what else I don't like? I don't like some of the modern art that is incredibly expensive. And, you know, I don't know, like Jackson Pollock. Do you know how much a Jackson Pollock painting, if it's original, will sell for? Do you know how much a Jackson Pollock print sells for? I don't know. It's called abstract expressionism. But if you look at it, to me, it looked like crayons. It looks like a child crayon. Yeah, $40,000. There's a used Jackson Pollock drip painting on eBay right now for $40,000. Just so people don't think I'm crazy, I'm going to share my screen and show you that. This is Jackson Pollock drip painting on canvas, and it's $40,000. Does that look, I don't know, does that look like great art to you, or does it look like somebody scribbling with paint? You know? But again, art is subjective. Some people love Jackson Pollock paintings. I think it looks like a child scribbled, you know. I mean, I guess it has. This is probably a bad example to bust balls on Jackson Pollock, because this one seems at least a little symmetrical, the circles and, you know, whatever. But some of his stuff is just like total, I don't know. It just looked like scribbles to me. I remember I was in a modern art museum with an old friend and a girlfriend, and he had headphones on, and there was Jackson Pollock paintings, and this girl I was with was sort of this hippie dippy crystal hippie bitch that was sort of into art and literature and stuff. She was very smart, but she was talking about how beautiful this Jackson Pollock painting was in the Philadelphia Art Museum. And my friend had headphones on, and literally he didn't realize it because he had headphones on. He like yelled in this big open hall. He goes, "It's fucking crayons!" And everybody in the art museum looked over, and then he takes his headphones off, and we're all looking at him shocked. And he goes, "Did I say that too loud?" And we're like, "Yeah, it's crayons." But yeah, art is subjective, right? Art is subjective. You never know what people are going to like. The fact, dude, I can't believe that people would pay $40,000 for a painting like that. You know, like a painting of real stuff. Yeah, science, evidence, and fringe. Good point. Says art is not measurable by money. Yeah, unless you're the artist that's trying to make a living, and then art is measurable by money, right? What about content creation? You know, to keep the lights on in here, I got to create a certain amount of art content to keep, even just to keep the lights on. Yeah, and I wanted to mention, we had plans some time ago to start doing in-person interviews. I want to thank that kind and generous benefactor on PayPal who sent the largest single PayPal pledge or donation in the history of our show. Because of that, I finally ordered the 2 microphones and a sound card and all kinds of stuff, and I have it going. So what that means is I also ordered some end tables and the microphone stands and all this stuff, and it's all just about set up in front of me. So this studio where I'm at now, we've got this desk here that's facing this way, but right in front of me there are 2 chairs, end tables, 2 microphones, and I've got to mount some cameras on the ceiling, but it looks like we're finally going to be able to do in-person interviews, and I've already got 3 or 4 people lined up. So I guess there's some changes coming to the show. One is tangent shows. I'm going to start bringing interesting, creative, powerful, artistic people here and talking to them because I enjoy that, and I hope you enjoy that as well. And then we're going to start doing in-person interviews and also lie detector tests. So if you're in the Philadelphia area, especially, and you know somebody you want to take a lie detector test, or somebody that has an incredible story that you would like to see take a lie detector test, email me at truthseekershow@gmail.com. We've got a very good polygraph machine right here on the set, and we'll be able to live give people polygraphs or lie detector tests, whatever you want to call it. Technically, it's a polygraph. It's multiple sensors. I'm even thinking of joining the National Polygraph Examiners Organization and taking some classes so that I do this right. Yes, a soil alpin. Was it Joe Rogan who weaponized you? I've said this before. Joe Rogan is largely responsible for this show being here. If anybody ever finds it, please do send it to me. But Joe Rogan once gave this speech that essentially amounts to, he was saying that, you know, okay, maybe you have a job you hate and you're not doing what you want to be doing, and start doing what you want to do part-time and treat it like a garden. And every day just go there and water that garden. For surely, if you water that garden will grow. And that's what made me start the show. I went, you know what, you're right. I'm not doing what I want to be running a show. I want to interview people and I want to do research and, you know, share great stories, explore great mysteries. And it's because of that speech that really got me off my butt. Like, okay, you're not gonna have a huge show right off the bat, but start watering the garden. And I did that, and here we are a few years later, and surely that garden has grown. First guest, Linda Moulton Howe, that machine would break. Yeah, let's start off easier than that. I can't just hook a path. And the other thing is, I don't know if you're aware of this, Patty, but pathological liars can pass lie detector tests. They're that good of liars, right? Algaray says, I'm glad you saw that Rogan speech. I love the work you do on Truth Seekers. Well, I thank you, and I appreciate that. I absolutely appreciate that. And there's been a lot of other influences, of course. Art Bell, Howard Stern. You know, I used to cut school to listen to Howard Stern in the morning. Like if I was walking to school listening to Howard Stern and it was really good, I would just turn around and go to the playground or something for a few hours, go to school late, Then I'd fake a note from my mother for why I was late the next day or whatever. I was so into talk radio too that I used to listen to something called WWDB in Philadelphia. I don't know if they're still in existence, but it was a talk radio station. And there was an overnight guy that I really enjoyed. He was fun to listen to, and I would stay up till way too late, like 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, and then I couldn't get up for school. Or I would get up for school and start listening to Howard Stern, and then I would cut school, you know? And then it was funny. My brother got a hippie van, and it wasn't running yet. He's a mechanic now. He's great at getting bad cars running. But put this hippie van in the yard next to my house, and I figured out that I could just pretend to leave for school and then just go in the yard and sit in the hippie van and listen to the radio all day. Yeah, I always had this intense interest in talk radio. So it's no surprise that I ended up here. And certainly had a lot more influences than that. So listen, friends, we've done our due diligence. I'm going to bounce on out of here, but I will be back tomorrow night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I suppose I will be here on Thursday as well. I'm going to try to squeeze in some other stuff. I've got some quick stories that I don't really want to spend a whole night on, but I may do those during the day. Let me know what you think of that idea. Do quick Truth Seekers quick shots or something like that. But for now, friends, that's all I've got for you. We want to thank you, kind and generous benefactors. I'm gonna plug the book one more time because I really think he deserves. You listen, this guy did a great job. Go buy the book; you'll enjoy it. Jim Morrison, Secret Teacher of the Occult: A Journey to the Other Side by Paul Wyld. He's an interesting guy in and of itself. Maybe we'll have him back and just talk about the music business. He's in the music business out in LA. Yeah. So, friends, I will add the links to Amazon where you can purchase the book. Mr. Wyld also said you could get it at your Barnes & Noble store or barnesandnoble.com. So that's all I got for you, friends. I'll be back tomorrow night, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. No place I would rather be, and I hope you'll be here with me. So that's all I got. Until next time, my name is Stephen Cambian. Good night, and God bless all of you.